A very warm welcome on this morning to the official part, the core part of the Co-Create Forum. On second thought, maybe not that warm of a welcome. Let's hope the weather lets us survive today in good spirit. Make sure you stay hydrated, very important. It might be even slightly warmer in some of the breakout rooms, so make sure you brace yourself for that. We did not expect temperatures to be, I think, 12, 13 degrees warmer than they would normally be at this time of the year. And over here in Europe, we don't have AC all that much as in other parts of the world. That said, for those of you who are joining now for the first time and didn't attend last night's session, my name is Matthias Honegger, and with Perspectives Climate Research, I lead this project called Co-Create, Conditions for Responsible Research on SRM, or Solar Radiation Modification, Analysis, Co-Creation, and Ethos. That's the full name of the project. And we're today here at Les Ateliers des Tanneurs, a building that was originally built in the heart of Brussels historic district, Marolles, in the 1890s as a palais du vin, so a wine palace, if you will. It was later, at some point, abandoned for a while and used as a storage unit, essentially, before being turned into what it is today, a venue to meet, have good conversations, maybe think about wine. There's also additionally a market in the same building around the corner, in case you might need something today. And yeah, so that said, quick note on safety. Please remember where you came in. That's the main emergency exit. You can also exit at the back of the room. There's the hallway to go over to the coffee break area, which will be set up later in the break. And there is, and I should show a slide for this, a emergency meeting point in the unlikely event of a real emergency, a fire or whatnot. It's on the street corner if you go out and to the left. That's where everyone's supposed to gather in such case. Here you can see a very elaborate and high quality picture of the venue map, so to speak, and the different rooms. The rooms are also indicated with signage on the walls, and folks with the yellow organizer tag are very happy to help you if you get lost. Also, in case of any other issues or questions, we are here to help. And who are we, broadly speaking? So again, for you, if you were here last night, this is a bit of a repetition, but for others, the Co-Create Consortium comprises of these 14 organizations spread around Europe and the UK. And we are fulfilling a ask that was expressed by the European Commission and co-funded by the UK Research, UKRI Research and Innovation Agency. Don't quote me on that. To explore the conditions for responsible research and the boundaries of that. What could constitute responsible research? What are the conditions? What are the guardrails? What governance might help steer towards responsible research and away of the opposite kind? And so that seems like a simple task, but it turns out it's quite complex if you really dig in. And we dug in a little bit in the first phase of this project by looking at several analytical pieces. A lot of that is going to be explored in the breakout sessions today. And coming back together over the course of this two-day meeting towards more and more specific needs, stakeholder needs, and possible answers to those needs in terms of guiding towards desirable action and guiding towards responsible process, as well as it comes to shaping and designing and running research in this space that is so contested. That said, I also want to emphasize that this is part of an ongoing exchange and dialogue, and really between the project team itself across these organizations and you as stakeholders, whether as researchers, research funders, regulators, or civil society members or staff of civil society organizations, and also perhaps linked to the research funders, you know, those who are evaluating research proposals or setting priorities of research topics. All of those are stakeholders, all of that includes you, and therefore we all are actually co-developing what this means, what the answer is to this challenge of research governance. And we're really gathering here at a meaningful moment, in my view, in a world that often feels messy and loud and polarized. All of us have chosen to be here and to contribute to something quite deliberate and I think hopeful as well. To come together across disciplines, regions, perspectives, and experiences, including also different motivations for research governance, which is going to be the theme of the opening panel, is to explore what motivates this call for additional governance or strengthening governance of the research itself. There are many different motivations, and I think it's sometimes helpful to be a bit more explicit about those. And I also want to acknowledge that many excellent initiatives already exist internationally to try and elucidate this question of responsible research and research governance, normative principles, ethical frameworks, and practical guidelines in many shapes, forms, and approaches. But this kind of work has not really been done in the European context and with a view to answering European priorities and values and viewpoints. And that's the demand that I understand has been expressed by the Commission for CoCreate to support filling that gap. Clearly, we're not starting from a blank page, but we are building on statements and expressions of direction that have already been made. On the one hand, by the Commission, and in particular the Commissioner for Research, Ekaterina Zaharieva, whom I quoted yesterday already as saying that these technologies show some promise, but they're far from mature, that research must continue, but the opinion of the European Group on Ethics, EGE, shows that research must be rigorous and ethical, and it must take account the full range of possible direct and indirect effects. And I think that's really an important backdrop to this discussion as well. Research has to answer to these expectations, clearly. And more recently, in I think it was the 21st of April, so just about a month ago, basically the group of EU Foreign Affairs Ministers, the EU Foreign Affairs Council, addressed SRM and reiterated some of the things that were already being said before by the Commission in the Climate Security Nexus communication in 2023, and adding a few pieces to that statement. But most importantly, worth highlighting in regards to research, on the one hand, a moratorium on deployment is what they're calling for, and at the same time, engagement in international governance discussions, including as regards research. And presumably that means research governance in that sense as well. So, and adding to that, I've heard last night two statements from Commission representatives inquiring about possibilities to also learn from or engage with international partners, such as the Advanced Research and Invention Agency, ARIA, in the UK, that has been really moving forward with public funding of research in a manner that I don't think is paralleled elsewhere yet. And so I think that's an important frame of reference as well to explore what we can learn from or align with or distance ourselves depending on the lessons learned from others in this space. So really, To summarize, we're here to enrich our thinking, and us, that's the consortium in the Co-Create project, by engaging with you, with stakeholders, as said. And today, we lay out a wide range of issues. We map them out through breakout conversations, and we come back together with a synthesis that gives us a glimpse of all these parallel conversations, so that in the evening we get to close the day with a reflection on what this all might mean for research governance going forward. And this is an attempt to create a shared frame of reference and a way to find the common language around our differences and agreements, and to find the steps that take us forward. And tomorrow we'll go even further in that direction towards specificity. As stated, the goal is ultimately to have useful guidance for the different stakeholders involved. That's including you. And therefore, one of the questions to you will be, what kinds of needs do you see in your professional environment to contribute to the responsible governance or responsible behavior in this field? I'd like to end on observing that your contributions will be noted, whether it's in plenaries or breakout groups. Breakout parallel sessions will be under Chatham House rules, but there will still be note takers in the room who are tracking the conversation on their laptops, and at the same time, a team of visual note takers who are accompanying us throughout the 2 days. And I'd like to invite Sylvia to share some words to that effect. Let's just jump right there.
Thanks, Matthias. Hello, everyone. So I'm Sylvia, and first of all, I'm here. I'm not here alone. I'm here with Chris and Norma, who are at the back. So I want you to all look towards the back, and the guys are giving a wave. So this is my incredible, talented team. And we're going to basically draw what you say throughout the event. And we don't come here as experts, but we're rather here to kind of bring in an outside perspective into what's going on for you. So our role is to really deeply listening to what's happening, observe, absorb everything that's going on around us, and then we're going to play that back to you in the form of illustration or drawings. And hopefully that's going to make you connect with the information in a more tangible way. So we do this for a couple of reasons. So the first one is visual images simplify complex information. So, you know, when conversations can become very dense, they can become quite abstract. When you have drawings, you have a way to sort of access that quicker, and it's going to make it easier for you to remember. The second reason is we're going to add another layer to the shared experience. So you're not just going to hear what is happening, but you're going to actually see it come to life in real time through illustration. And lastly, it's a really helpful way to have a visual summary of what's going on in the room, especially helpful for people who are not here. I know that this is being live streamed, for example, so it's quite powerful to have a visual that people can look at and see what happened throughout the event, and then quickly get access or connect with that information. So over the next few days, we're going to be listening out for insights, for key decisions, for moments of tension, of excitement. I'm sure there'll be a lot of that. And we're going to capture in different ways. So today, you're going to see our drawings popping up in the screens all around the space. We're going to be with our iPads capturing digitally. And tomorrow, we're going to switch a little bit and work with analog boards. There is also an interactive board in the coffee area, which some of you might have already seen. And that's really your chance to, you know, contribute your specific idea and see it illustrated by us throughout the event. So I really invite you to sort of engage with it. I really think that's, you know, in the in-between spaces is where the magic happens, in the, you know, grabbing a coffee with your colleague and playing back what you're hearing. So, you know, engage with it. And or simply use it as a way to reflect on the conversations that we had throughout the event. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to capturing the event with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and a big hand to Sylvia and her team. Thank you. I briefly skipped over a slide that showed the QR code for the agenda. There are leaflets on the walls that you can scan to access the agenda in case you don't have it on the phone already. So it's all digital, saving some paper and some trees in the process. A big project and meeting like this forum requires a lot of thought and effort, going into organizing, communicating, and simply operating a very complex plan. And our partner in the project, Climate Strategies, has been brilliantly executing on all these issues, including also very complex communication on a very complex issue to diverse audiences. And so on that cue, I want to invite Anna to share some words as well.
Thanks, Matthias. Hi, everyone. Great to see you here. Thanks. I'm Ana Gonzalez. I'm head of projects and climate strategies, an international knowledge brokerage organization working with a global network of leading climate researchers like Matthias here and Axel there, all dedicated at bridging the gap between research and policy to accelerate meaningful climate action. While we are usually known for our work on just transitions, our portfolio is actually much broader than that, stemming from food security, adaptation, policy modeling, trade, technological innovation, and governance. And in all these areas, we play a similar role. We act as trusted broker, connecting science, policy, and practice across divides. It is with this mission that we came to the Co-Create Consortium, where we lead communication and dissemination activities within the project. And we feel honored to be part of the Co-Create Forum. Everyone in the organization team has gone above and beyond to ensure that it is an inclusive, neutral space where diverse perspectives can come together and discuss the future of SRM research governance in the European Union, but also beyond. Now I'd like to give you a glimpse of who's in the room with us today. Sorry, the clicky thingy. Yes. As shared by yourselves, we have a majority here in the room of researchers, followed by 29.2% of representatives of NGOs and civil society organizations, 13.3% of government representatives and policymakers. We have members of the Co-Create Consortium here with us today, 6.2% of people representing an authority agency or research funding organization, 1% of philanthropy, as well as some that did not see themselves reflected in any of these categories. While Co-Create is actually an EU-funded project, largely focusing on European research area, this conference actually brought together perspectives from all around the world. Beyond the European Union, we have in the room people coming from Argentina, Australia, Bangladesh, Benin, Brazil, Canada, China, Ghana, India, Kenya, Mexico, New Zealand, Nigeria, Pakistan, Philippines, Switzerland, the UK, and the US. Again, we are incredibly grateful that you're here with us today, but we all have a role to play in ensuring that these conversations are held within a safe space. So with this in mind, I would like to remind you when you registered, you agreed to a code of conduct, and if you haven't read it lately, we invite you to scan the QR code here. Please note that whoever is not complying with this code of conduct, we will have to ask you to leave the premises. So maybe just for a quick glimpse, what we mean with unacceptable behavior within this event, for example, is intimidating, harassing, or bullying, as well as materials with discriminatory, derogatory, or demeaning content. In that sense, we expect that throughout the conference, you follow all applicable rules of the event and the venue, treat all participants with respect and dignity, do not take part in demeaning, discriminatory, or harassing behavior, or introduce any unacceptable materials or speech, cooperate with the event staff and the co-create team, are mindful of your surroundings and other participants, and alert conference organizers if you notice a dangerous situation or someone in distress. With the code of conduct, you also must have seen our rules for co-creation. So we actively listen to each other and give people time and means to articulate their views. We do our best to be concise and clear in the discussion, allowing everyone to have a chance to participate. We participate with the intention and stay within topic of discussion. We try to build on each other's views and encourage diverse perspectives, and we try to channel kindness and inclusion in our interactions, assuming best of intentions and always being willing to forgive. So yeah, thank you very much for your understanding, and once again, we're very excited to have you here. It's going to be a fantastic time, and I wish everyone really impactful conversations today.
Excellent. This brings us to the end of the introductory remarks and actually to the start of the opening panel. And I would like to invite my fellow panelists onto the stage. As I indicated, please do. Actually, yeah, if you can sit in the order that's indicated, that's going to be helpful for our audience to know who is who quite clearly. You can, yeah, exactly. Perfect. Yeah. I might then, if yeah, that's good. Okay. As I indicated earlier, the premise of this panel is to explore the different motivations that stand behind the why we are seeking to strengthen governance on SRM research. This is a bit of a horizon-setting conversation, and really also to touch on some of the concerns that I know are included when we touch on this topic of solar radiation modification overall. For this, so we have brought 4 distinguished speakers who will share their respective angle onto this question in brief introductory remarks. We have Peter Framha from the Woodwell Climate Research Center. We have Portia Adade-Williams from CSIR in Ghana. We have Arte Gupta from Wageningen University. And we have finally Clara Botta from the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering, DSG in short. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for being part of this conversation. I think it will be a very helpful scene setting. And with that, I'd like to invite a first round of remarks, starting with Peter. On the 2 guiding questions, what is a key motivator for why SRM research governance is important, and what should or could responsible SRM research look like? Take it away.
Thank you, Matthias, and for the opportunity to join you today and over this 2-day forum. I wanted to start by grounding the discussion of SRM research and governance in the context of the climate change challenges that we're collectively facing. Peter Vine spoke briefly to this in last evening's session, but just to remind ourselves, so the past 2 years, we have collectively, as humanity, sent more than 40 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere each year, primarily through the burning of fossil fuels, also some from land use change and deforestation. These are historically high levels. It's not to say we haven't done a lot of made a lot of important progress on clean energy and slowing deforestation. Clean energy expansion has happened quite dramatically, mostly or partly both through policy and economics. But it's clearly not enough because energy demand is increasing. And so as we continue to send carbon dioxide to the atmosphere at record levels, our efforts to mitigate are so far dramatically falling short. And that puts us in the context where we are poised to sail past the 1.5 see Paris target in terms of the remaining carbon budget for that temperature within the next couple of years. As a consequence of this, temperatures will continue to rise until emissions reach net zero, no more emissions going into the atmosphere than coming out, and we are some decades away from that, even under the most optimistic scenario of aggressive mitigation and some carbon dioxide removal. And so that puts us on a path with current policies to get to somewhere between 2.5 and 3 degrees Celsius. Perhaps we can do better, but we're falling short in this regard. Mitigation and adaptation remain essential, but it's hardly surprising that we're having conversations about SRM and the potential for solar radiation modification to limit global temperature increases and the attendant harms, extreme heat, and other manifestations of a warming climate. And so we are seeing, as Peter Vine highlighted last evening, a rise in not only interest but funding for research from some governments, notably the UK, from private philanthropies, and perhaps most worryingly from venture capital in support of private commercial interests in SRM research. We can come back and discuss that, I think, over time. And it's really important that, from my point of view, that research be done and it be done responsibly. Now, what does that mean? Responsible, there are very large knowledge gaps, just to be clear, with respect to SRM and its implications. So I'm an ecologist, and understanding the ecological implications of solar radiation modification is a major gap in our understanding of its impacts. So not just the changes in temperature and precipitation on natural and managed ecosystems, but also the changes in from direct to diffuse sunlight, the decoupling of temperature and carbon dioxide levels that happen with SRM, the polarization of light that happens with SRM. These all have potentially substantial and consequential impacts on ecosystems, and we know next to nothing about them. So we are operating in the dark, and decision makers who are likely to be facing increasingly vexing choices about whether and under what conditions to support ultimate deployment are lacking basic information, core information upon which to evaluate the risks and potential of these really challenging and consequential technologies. So what does responsible research need to address? Well, obviously research needs to be robust, have high scientific merit, subject to peer review. It needs to be salient to decision makers and citizens' concerns in addressing key policy relevant questions. And perhaps most importantly, it needs to be trusted. There needs to be legitimacy and trust associated with the research in a way that we've seen has been largely lacking, particularly as it relates to small-scale outdoor experiments that have been canceled or avoided because of public pushback. That has in no small part been a consequence of the fact that there are no standards for governing these technologies and research into them, and that leads to and dramatically increases public distrust around concerns that get raised quite legitimately with respect to the implications and the anticipation of slippery slope to deployment and so on. So just to say a few words about what responsible research looks like, in my view. Bear with me. It's research that fills priority knowledge gaps. It's research that's international in scope with participation from a broad range of perspectives and areas of expertise. It's research that adheres to robust guidelines for scientific merit, for transparency with regard to funding sources, for public consultation and engagement. And I know we'll be unpacking these in discussions over the next 2 days. So I also want to highlight that responsible SRM research needs to be carried out in the public interest. That is to say, primarily with public funding from governments that are themselves committed to mitigation and adaptation and to evidence-based decision-making. And I just want to note that that leaves out some important governments if you take those criteria seriously. It should avoid creating or supporting vested financial interests, inappropriate intellectual property claims, or other threats to the public interest. And it should establish really strong guardrails that constrain the potential for research to unduly accelerate a pathway to deployment. And I know there are discussions underway, and they need to be had, with respect to whether and under what conditions, for example, a moratorium on deployment might be established that would both enable research but also constrain deployment in a constructive way. So why don't I stop there?
Yeah, I was going to say, is that a good point to end on?
Well,
Okay.
yes, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's already a very extensive list, and I think a pretty clear message. So with that, I'll directly invite Portia to share her thoughts on this.
Yeah, thank you, and good morning, everyone. Thanks, really, Matthias, for having me. And I'm really excited to join the conversation, coming right after Peter from a researcher perspective. And so for me, I would say that to even start SRM conversations, it's research. It begins right from climate vulnerability, uncertainty, and then responsibility, which I think Peter has kind of unpacked very well. I will not touch on that, but I will go straight to what a key motivator for governance looks like. And for me, the key motivator is the views, the concerns, and also the aspirations of issues around SRM and the kind of research system that we hope to have. The key thing is that there are risks and there are harms. Whether we really want to look at research from the perspective of deployment, there is harm there. If we really want to look at generally research, in terms of basic research, there could even be harm. I know yesterday the discussions was going around maybe less risk among others, but we cannot also overlook that. If we really want to dismiss SRM and not go there at all, without adequate inquiry and research into it, there is harm we are actually accumulating. And then we talk about the moral hazard around it, which we cannot overlook. That also, if we want to think about the moral hazard and also overlook it entirely, there could be harm. So whichever way we go around it, whether it's basic research, whether it's modeling, whether it's lab experiments, moving on even higher, or even the social, ethical, and political research, when you go and stand in front of researchers or respondents to talk about SRM, sometimes you are asked the question in such a way that you stand there and you don't know how to respond to it. So all those you prepare yourself for. So it brings us back to the point of research governance. And the point I'm trying to stress here is that when we talk about governance, we do not want to look at the science alone or the technology alone. It brings us to what is even research governance. I think if we look at that critically, it's important because the governance involves the systems, the principles, the policies, the procedures, the oversight, and it comes in such a way that it's really coming to guide how research is planned. So even at the planning stage, we should be thinking about governance. When we are talking about how research is conducted, the monitoring, and again, the reporting, which I would not overemphasize from yesterday has come up strongly. It all boils to the point that we need a robust research governance framework. And for me, that is very, very key, and that should drive our thinking and our motivation around it. And I think if we look at what responsible research is, Peter has highlighted a number that I had even talked about already. Usually we'll think about, okay, let ethics review systems, institutional policies, qualities, M&Es, among others. But beyond this, if we want to talk about very good research governance or responsible one, we should be looking at, for me, 4 key things. It should be inclusive knowledge production. We cannot have a few experts sitting to talk about research on SRM, and that is okay. No, for me, that is not okay. And then it should be research that is really driving mitigation and adaptation efforts. Bring the agency of that at the forefront. Then you can build the trust that you need from public and the acceptance of it. And so for me, if it is anything that is not driving that agency, that is not responsible research for me. And transparency and public engagement, and that is why we keep emphasizing that in this space. Again, trust is very important in this space if we want to be very open and transparent. And then the last for me is context. It matters so critically that if we are talking about responsible governance, we cannot say that we will not look at how risk is experienced in Africa is different from how it is experienced in Asia and how it's experienced in Europe. And so context become very, very key. And so if we are highlighting on these, then I think that we are driving responsible governance. Thank you. I'll end it here.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I cannot attempt to summarize because you really cover a lot of very important ground indeed, and thank you for that. With that, right over to you, Arti, please.
Thank you, Matthias. These are very important and timely questions, and I'm happy to share my view. I'm going to try to stick to my notes, otherwise I'll talk for more than 4 minutes. So first point, and I hope that this can be taken on board for the next 2 days, that we have to consider the political context within which any SRM research is pursued. Research governance and responsible research governance does not occur in a political and geopolitical vacuum. So we need to ask ourselves, what will SRM research enable? What ends will be served? Not what ends should be served, but what ends will be served. If not, we risk having an irrelevant conversation, which would be a great pity, actually. Or at best, we risk having an irrelevant conversation for the next 2 days. And at worst, we risk actually feeding and enabling the forces that we all might be worried about. So why do I say this? Let's take Stardust as an example. It encapsulates all the worries that many of us share here: for-profit engagement in a planet-altering technology. But the most crucial questions that Stardust raises are not, have they been transparent about their particle? Have the risks versus the benefits been assessed by scientists through scientific peer review? No, clearly they haven't been. But the most fundamental questions are not these procedural research governance questions. They are the questions: who will control the particle? Who will decide about it? Who will use it? Who will develop and deploy this planet-altering technology, and to serve what interests? And related to that then is the fundamental question: are there any prospects at all in our geopolitically tense, highly conflicted, unequal world of having stable, effective, inclusive, multi-decadal global governance of SRM deployment in a context where planetary scale impacts cannot be known in advance, will be unequally distributed with significant winners and losers? So if the answer to that, and this is primarily a point that governance before research, I mean, we have to consider this question, this fundamental question about global governance. And if the answer to that fundamental question, that this planet-altering technology could never be governed in a stable, fair, and inclusive manner over decades or centuries, is no, then that has fundamental implications for research governance. Because Stardust is not an anomaly or an outlier. It signals how things are developing and will develop, where SRM is no longer a climate-related intervention, despite everything we heard about accelerating climate change, something that we're all concerned about in this room. It's not a climate-related intervention anymore. It's about who will intervene to control the stratosphere and to what end. The recent EU Council decision expressing grave concern about solar geoengineering is not placed under the climate subheading. It's under the subheading of security. So in such a context, then we need to ask, what is responsible research? And what is the EU's role here? And one thing that we've heard in response to Stardust is that we need to counter Stardust with public financing, internationally coordinated, transparent, and inclusive research, quite apart from the question, who actually has an incentive to realize this kind of inclusive, transparent, equitable research? Who will actually roll that out? And do we have any past instances of this? The more important point is, no matter how well-governed public funding and research might be, it will not prevent another 10 Stardusts from emerging. So what then? And so if we take seriously the unknown, unknowable, and unequally distributed harms of this planet-altering technology, then responsible research is that research which facilitates design and development of a prohibitory regime. And this is a reason why a large and growing group of academics and governments are calling for non-development and non-use of SRM. This includes not only 600 plus academics, many of them are not in this room, but it also includes 54 African environmental ministers and highly vulnerable small island developing states, Vanuatu and Fiji, for example, who are existentially threatened by climate change. And it is these countries who are existentially threatened by climate change who are saying solar geoengineering is absolutely no option and should be taken off the table. So what about the EU? The essential need of the hour now is for the EU to align with African countries and vulnerable SIDS in promoting and designing prohibitory global governance. And what this means for responsible research governance, responsible research governance is not only about enabling, it is also about restricting. So what this means for responsible research governance is not enabling the development of technological capabilities via funding outdoor experimentation that tests materials or means of injection, because that's the slippery slope towards deployment. Responsible research governance is restricting technology development and directing public funds towards researching and realizing the nuts and bolts of prohibitory global governance and research governance. And many in our academic network are doing exactly this. We are examining what we can learn from other prohibitory regimes around biological weapons or anti-personnel landmines, for example. So in short, and to conclude, at this critical juncture in time, the EU should stand with the countries of the global south, calling for prohibitory governance and leverage any public funding to this end. Thanks.
Thank you, Arti. A very clearly stated motivation for research governance. Thank you for that, indeed. And last but not least, we have Clara, please.
Yeah, a lot has been said already, so it's hard for me to close this first round. But I guess to your first question, Matthias, on why, or the key motivator for talking about research governance, I feel like this is always a question in SRM conferences. And when I think about the first SRM conference I went 7 years ago, it was also a question there on the table. The importance and the relevance is still there, but the urgency is what's missing in this conversation. And I'm glad that RT brought up Stardust, but it doesn't apply only to Stardust. We're operating not in a guidelines vacuum. The guidelines exist. We know what should be done, but it doesn't mean that it is actually being done. So I think if we had a more structured research governance framework, then we wouldn't need to be having this conversation here again after, you know, a decade of more governance-focused conversations. And again, while we're still talking about governance, not just for research, but also for deployment, which includes a moratorium, we know that the climate situation is only getting worse. But apart from several points that have already been said on what responsible governance could look like, I think one point that's missing is specifically on research design. We've been saying a lot that citizens should be consulted, but then ultimately that's after the research process has already been designed, and I'm glad that Dominic touched a lot on this point yesterday. We can't talk about SRM if not in a public good context, and if Stardust, for example, is saying this, then why are you not just consulting with the public, but actually bringing people in the research? And that doesn't mean that research will then be allowed, but after you explain, maybe citizens in that specific region will say that they don't want it, and that's part of, you know, an inclusive or appropriate research governance framework. And I think it's really hard for us to say that, you know, the global south wants this or the global south doesn't want this, because you have individual countries that have stated positions, but do the citizens know what their country's position is? And we have several examples, and it's not even an example, it's just a fact in multiple countries where people have never heard about SRM, let alone specific technologies. So I don't think we can say just because a single country has already come up with a position that that's ultimately what people want, and that should be a component of any sort of governance that we talk as well. And if we're talking about research with and not for publics, then I guess that also apply for regions. European researchers or countries can say that we'll be funding research into this so that it will be, you know, again, the public good of a certain region of the world if they're also not working together on this. So it goes beyond being interdisciplinary only in a research setting, but we have to find ways to get more people as, you know, active components of research. And we might not know how to do that perfectly, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying to. But yeah, I guess I'll stop here because the most interesting thing is for us to have a chat, I guess.
Fantastic. Wow. Thank you so much already at this stage for such wide-ranging and deep-cutting statements on what motivates research governance on this issue. I really think we covered the ground from many different angles. And if I'm to just highlight a few of the points that I heard, in particular from Peter, I heard an emphasis on the quality of research. From Portia, I heard an emphasis that research needs to be designed in a manner that drives public agency, including in different regions, grounded in different regions. From Arti, I heard that research must help enforce policy that seeks to prevent deployment, acknowledging the complexity of politics and account for that. And from Clara, I think last but not least, I heard that research must be with and not just for publics, and again, also in different world regions, reflecting the public's views, which in many ways are not known at this stage or not sufficiently known. And perhaps linked to that, a need for us not to jump to conclusions that would not represent views that haven't been heard, if that's a fair recap. So given that, can we dive a little bit into one particular aspect of this? And perhaps you can pick from three. I'm not going to put it to one of you specifically, so you can choose one of three questions. Is research in all cases automatically a preparation for deployment? Is the point of governance of research to ensure a specific outcome or ensure a good process? And third, is it a fair statement that a key motivation for research governance is to ensure it answers policymakers' knowledge needs and questions on risks and uncertainties of SRM? And let's go in reverse order, starting with you, Clara, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. I think I'll take the second question then on outcomes. You know, when we think about SRM research, I guess that's also linked to the first question. If research should have deployment in mind, or
if there's also, perhaps I'll rephrase it, are there conditions to shape research that help prevent deployment? In fact, answering your point, is there a way to shape research through governance that it actually helps prevent deployment to the extent that this is the political decision at hand?
I think if proper research is being conducted, it won't or it shouldn't have deployment in mind, because you should be humble enough to accept that it might not be a feasible option, or you might find ecological impacts that are very destructive or societal impacts that are very destructive. So I understand that, especially for those who are working more on the technological development and readiness, that's not something that you would like to find, but you should be humbled to know that if you get to that point, then you shouldn't continue that research. And we have examples in the field where that happened as well, and activities or research activities were stopped. But and that's linked to process as well. If you don't have a specific outcome in mind, then the process is what's actually worthwhile dedicating your engagement and inclusivity efforts in. And especially if we think about justice, which is in the name of DSG and what our work is mainly about, justice shouldn't be something to come, like after we have the technologies ready to be used, if we ever get to the point, then we talk about justice. No, it's really important to understand that justice happens as we speak. The fact that we're here, even though we're a very small and privileged group to be having this conversation, there are also justice elements that should be considered as we speak and as we go, and not addressing that or letting justice to be addressed only when the time comes is very unjust, I would say. And not only to the process itself, but then again to the ones who will be most impacted by these technologies, for better or for worse. So yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yes, I think that is the key challenge, right? That if there is now, there is a decision that there should be a moratorium on deployment, how do you design, or what is responsible research governance then that will allow for that possibility to prevent deployment? And I think there is a possibility to shape research that helps prevent deployment, and that is essentially no public funding for research that promotes technology or that allows for technology development of technological capabilities, whether that's testing injection materials or modes of injection, etc. So, and that would include small scale, of course, also large scale outdoor experimentation that would test these technological capabilities and materials, etc., and thereby have potentially risk a slippery slope to development of the technology and hence its deployment. So I think there are, as I think we kind of don't disagree in our responses, which is a nice thing, that there should be guardrails and oversight mechanisms and no public funding for anything that develops technological capabilities.
Okay, I'll take the first question as a researcher, obviously, and I think you asked it, the first time was perfect. It's maybe research deployment, and that's how I want to pick it from. Research is not deployment to me. There are different approaches to SRM now, and as I had earlier highlighted in my first intervention, we have basic research, and that is basic scientific research. We have climate modeling and simulation, more on computer-based assessments. We have lab experiments and observations. We also have outdoor field experiments where those who do this would say it's to inform computer modeling. We have also the commercial exploration and prototyping. And we have research on SRM that is on social, ethical, and political research. And so depending on whichever angle you are picking it, so it cannot be generalized as research really going to deployment. I think basically when we look at, maybe I'll pick it from an African perspective or developing country perspective, I would say that when we talk about research is for SRM now in the stage we are in now, it's even a challenge creating awareness about it to even talk about going to field experiments We are nowhere near that. So you cannot be maybe in a developing country context and say research is deployment. No, but it is very important. The message from research to put out there is to strengthen understanding on what SRM, the technology and all that needs to be said around it, is to help assess uncertainties, because it's very uncertain and there are always questions coming around that, and it's only research that can help us to answer that. Is to improve governance and also our preparedness towards governance, because we heard yesterday we don't have one framework existing or any existing that is really primarily focused on SRM. And so to prepare us towards that approach in our discussions this morning, it is only research that can tell us that. And also to help us take informed decision. Whether you stand for SRM, whether you do not stand for SRM, I think it should be informed by some kind of research and information from research than maybe to take a decision just like taking a decision. And so research plays these roles to me than to just straightforward say research is deployment. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for these questions, Matthias. I also want to speak to the research and deployment relationship, if I could. I mean, I do think it's possible, but not straightforward, to imagine the design of a moratorium on deployment in a way that would be both constraining of the concerns, addressing the concerns that outdoor experiments and SAI in particular risk providing momentum towards deployment, which I think is we should not have that as a normative goal. And if a moratorium can be constructed in such a way as to constrain that, and from my point of view, open the door in a way that elevates the value of those outdoor experiments for the knowledge that's gained in terms of providing information to inform better modeling and all the benefits in terms of understanding that those experiments could provide, I think that's a good thing. Actually designing that moratorium to achieve those goals is really tricky, and I don't think there's been sufficient scholarship on how to do that, how one might do that in a way that doesn't essentially become just a ban, but truly a moratorium. And what are the triggers by which you take it off, and all the dimensions that go into a moratorium. What we can learn from other experiences with a moratorium, I think, is an area that has not been fully explored and deserves some attention. But I also think that the relationship between research and deployment speaks to modeling as well as to outdoor experiments. And we don't talk about it, I think, enough. And the choice of scenarios that are used in models can kind of reify particular approaches or understandings of how deployment might happen. Some might describe a kind of, I don't know, a Goldilocks version of a scenario in which if you do everything perfectly, everybody's better off by and large in terms of temperature and precipitation. But of course, the world doesn't work in a Goldilocks way. And so really making sure that responsible research includes a breadth of scenarios to better understand with modeling a range of plausible ways in which deployment might proceed in order to better understand the risks and potential to better inform deployment decisions under any circumstances. That's I think a gap in our understanding, and I would prefer, maybe speaking to Artie's point, that that kind of research and indeed the outdoor experiments be publicly funded rather than philanthropically or privately funded, that there's better control over transparency and accountability with public funding than with private and certainly for-profit funding.
Brilliant, thanks for this set of responses. I think deepening some of the key points or key questions here. I want to make sure that everyone in the room is also heard and has a chance now that probably coffee has kicked in to share your views. And if you can go to the next slide, there will be a QR code, if that's possible. Otherwise, I have to reach for the ticker. Okay, there we go. Where you're welcome to point your phone at the QR code and actually connect to the Slido survey. It's a single question and hopefully straightforward at this point to share some thoughts on that. You're welcome to share more than one answer, but keep it concise so that we can read it on the screen in a moment. As you're doing that, I'm going to invite my fellow panelists to start thinking about a closing statement, if possible, keeping it to 1 or 2 sentences. I'm challenging you to that, given that we've already used a lot of time, if that's okay. So let's see. I imagine answers are starting to come in. Everyone had a chance to scan the code. That seems to be the case. So if possible, you guys could click on the link at the bottom right to start showing results. Does that work? Sorry, I may not have given enough heads up on this particular logistical step. Oh, okay. Is it? Oh, okay. While it's loading, why don't we do that? Let's open for comments and questions from the floor at this stage. Otherwise, we lose precious time to have an exchange. Do we have mics in the audience? The lady in the back there? Yeah, right there.
Hello, lady in the back. Hello, Gosia Śmieszek-Rice, Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program. Thank you very much for this excellent panel and introduction. Peter, in your opening remarks, you mentioned venture capital. And my question to the panel concerns discussion of, well, we are speaking about governance, about public funding, which I think, well, we can see that public funding could be much better governed, guided in this respect. And yet the pace with which venture capital is moving is entirely different. So my question is, how do you see the application of discussion that we are having to those projects, initiatives that might be funded with private money and that are ultimately moving at an entirely different pace than public discussion on those matters? Thank you.
If I'm to paraphrase, how do we govern venture capital flowing into research, given the tools that we, quote unquote, have, the we being really the stakeholders that I listed, from regulators, researchers themselves, public research funders, or perhaps, well, the voluntary adherence of also philanthropic research funders. Any takers, any thoughts on that question?
Are all of them? Yeah. I think the first thing that comes to my mind is it's not necessarily about the venture capital itself, but if they're expecting a return on investment, is it going to be a for-profit endeavor ultimately? Because if yes, then I think all of us would agree here that that funding shouldn't be going into that specific project, because then you know that, again, the outcome expected is going to be to deploy that technology so that you can get your investment back. So I think that's my first thought, and I guess it depends for what that investment is being made for.
Yeah, I think the key issue is whether, in fact, what will become of the technology that's developed by venture capital. And ultimately, that comes to public authorities. So taking the example of Stardust, and this is what we said, I mean, it's very difficult to prevent 10 Stardusts from emerging in the future, despite all the good governed public research we might have. So then the question is, who would buy Stardust technology? And it would look for a government to do that and to deploy. And that's where prohibitory governance plays a key role. We need a norm shift towards non-use and non-development of this technology. And if a vast majority of the world says this is not something that should be developed and deployed and used, then private venture capital and the development of it will have to be curbed, because ultimately it'll have to be a state or a group of states that will deploy this multi-decadal, multi-generational technology. So we have to encircle venture capital in that manner, I would say.
You want to add?
Just briefly, I'm no expert in intellectual property rights, but clearly governments can set standards by which intellectual properties are granted, and constraining the opportunity for
Just closer.
intellectual property on this is going to be really important and really challenging to do in our current political context.
Great. I'm sure there's many more questions. So I think, sorry, I'm blanking. Right there in the middle, yeah.
Thank you.
Sophia.
Yes. Hi, my name is Sophia. I'm from the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs. I have two questions. One is for Portia. You mentioned that funding on SRM research should also be driving mitigation and adaptation. I was wondering if you could develop further on that in terms of how that would actually be occurring, what, if you have examples of how that could be the case. And then a second question is for all of the panelists. I was wondering, what are your thoughts on what we're seeing, which is, you know, the multiplicity of bottom-up kind of governance principles emerging in terms of research on SRM? Do you see this as a risk of fragmentation for the governance of SRM research, or rather a kind of, you know, structuration and integration of governance for SRM research? So what are your thoughts on the current, you know, multiplicity of bottom-up principles? Thank you.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, okay, so yeah, thank you for the question. I think when I brought in mitigation adaptation, it was more on research governance, responsible research governance. And I think at the global level, there is still momentum on making sure that there are mitigation efforts and adaptation efforts improved. And so even from a developing country perspective, anything that has to do with moral hazards really is on top of conversations when you are even talking about SRM. So the point I was trying to make is that in terms of responsible research governance, it should be one that is driving towards improving the agency to still keep mitigation and adaptation high, and not something that brings it, like the importance of it is not brought forth. And so it's very key, and not really driving finance that is going for mitigation, adaptation, and then SRM. So it's looking at responsible research governance and the need to still drive the agency for mitigation and adaptation, and making sure it's still not killing that political momentum to have that actually happening. I think that was the context. Specifically on finance to drive that, I don't think on top of my head I have any example now. Thank you.
On your question on bottom-up governance, I think it's very much needed, because then again, we can't wait for the top-down to happen. And DSG and other partners are about to launch SGRG, that's the Solar Geoengineering Research Governance Platform, and that's one attempt to do that, because as I said in the beginning, we know, good practices and what guidelines for research should look like, but because we don't have this top-down enforcement, we have to find the middle where these guidelines that we think should be enforced can happen, and that can happen either through peer pressure, for example. If you know the guidelines are out there and you have, you know, a group of researchers that are already abiding by those principles, then you would like to be respected as a new researcher in the field as well. So following that could be an example to do. And so, yeah, I do see the value of bottom-up, especially in the stage we're in now.
I'd like to give one more question space if possible. I saw Herman, if you want to, if there's a mic. Sorry. Just to mix a few more points in there.
Thank you very much. My name is Herman Russenberg from the University of Delft in the Netherlands. Artie, you translated the moratorium directly into a ban on technology development, right? But the moratorium also comes with an, let's say, a periodic reassessment. Do we still have to prolong the moratorium, yes or no? And for this, you have to do the research into risks, possibilities, but also technical feasibility. So how can you do then such a reassessment if you have a ban on the technology development itself? So how do you see this? And how does the other panel members see this?
Thanks. I think that's an important tension to tease out, if possible. Do you want to respond to that, Artie?
Yeah, thank you, Herman. I think, yes, my perspective and that of 600 other scientists is that this technology should not be developed. So that goes beyond a moratorium, which, as you say, could be seen as temporary. And, but of course, your question is, and I think that this is all the point also, and this came up earlier as well, is about reducing uncertainties, assessing risks, and assessing whether a technology is will do what it's supposed to do, its efficacy, etc. But the core point here is that no amount of research is actually going to give us the answer that we want about this technology. No amount of idealized or non-idealized even modeling, no small-scale or even large-scale experimentation will tell us what we actually want to know about this planet-altering technology, which is whether the benefits will outweigh the risks, or what the unequally distributed impacts at planetary scale will be. For that, we would need planetary scale experimentation, if we really want to know that. And planetary scale experimentation is akin to deployment of the technology. So therefore, I think that and that's a very risky endeavor. And once we have planetary scale experimentation and deployment, we are in a different world. And so therefore, I think that research that you're suggesting would allow assessment of technologies will in fact lead us down a path to deployment.
I think this speaks to an underlying challenge that we face that I think requires different perspectives to address, which is, what do we mean by words like research, technology development, or climate scale testing? I think some structure has been provided by colleagues in the consortium in terms of describing different types of experiments, but yeah, I think the underlying tension remains, and I think needs further exploration, because there's that real tension that holding off on activities that could also show problems by having small-scale field experiments could also have the counterproductive effect, no? So I take your point, Artie, very much so, but I want to note that there is a tension on this, I think, clearly, from what I'm hearing. I'd like to take two last statements from the floor. Axel, yes, go ahead.
Thanks a lot. Axel Michaelova from Perspectives. So my question relates to how could research governance nudge research into the ability to actually identify rogue attempts for deployment. So research that would, for example, ensure that we have a full planetary monitoring system that would identify even the smallest attempt to deployment. Because I would think that those who are eager to deploy would try to hide themselves, and that if we can get research governance to a way where we have a proactive nudging to enable the identification of any stuff that is close to deployment, I think it could be very helpful. Thank you.
research for detection, in short. Yeah. Are there quick responses to that? Agreed? Nodding? Yeah? Is that, wow, we have agreement on this panel. Wow, that's surprising. One last, I see Jim in the back there.
Hi, yes, it's a question for Peter. Peter, you mentioned that, up front, I do receive money from philanthropic and NGO and public funding for research. But you said that the philanthropics do have agendas. I wonder whether you want to, and are therefore not sort of truly independent. I wondered whether you wanted to sort of go further on that, or maybe I'm paraphrasing what you said.
Yeah, I don't recall saying something about philanthropies having agendas, although they do. I don't know what that means, specifically in terms of governing philanthropic funding, other than at minimum to require transparency of where funding sources are coming from for various kinds of research, to make sure, for example, that philanthropic funding is not driving outcomes in terms of seeking further funding, for example, by having expectations about kinds of outcomes that come in. It's really tricky to do that in practice. And I guess I want to say, as a related point, that there are roles for governments to provide guidelines about what's appropriate for philanthropic funding. But there are also roles for other actors in this space, including scientific societies, including scientific journals, and the requirements of transparency for funding sources that journals often claim to have but don't actually enforce. And so there will continue to be private philanthropic funding, and I worry about its scaling up. Strongly prefer public funding for all the reasons of transparency and accountability, but there are some things we can do, I think, to ensure that the ways in which philanthropic funding might coerce particular kinds of research outcomes can be constrained.
Great. Was that also your closing statement, or is there something?
No, of course
very
not.
Quick? Okay. Keep it to 1 to 2 sentences was my guidance, if that's possible.
Thank you, Matthias. Artie spoke of the impossibility, essentially, of global governance of these technologies, and I want to just acknowledge that international multilateral governance of these technologies is extremely hard, would be extremely hard. I don't know that I would agree that it would be impossible, but it's important to take account of extreme challenges. But that's also true of the challenges that we face with addressing climate change. Multilateral action, evidence-based decision-making is in very short supply, and that applies both to mitigation and adaptation, as well as it does to the potential role of SRM. We need to look at both of these and recognize that our job is to work against those trajectories of the decline of multilateral collaboration and work towards approaches that can actually work.
Brilliant. 2 very long sentences, I think. Great, thank you. Portia.
Yeah, so I think the representation here is excellent for this forum. What we saw this morning on the chats, the diverse representation is excellent, and I'm hoping that for the next 2 days, the forum will grant us that opportunity, not only deepen our technical understanding, but our collective responsibility, not to kind of confuse the agency with readiness, but how we can proceed carefully in such a way that our collective efforts will take us there. I think that is what I really look forward to in the next 2 days, how our various responsibilities come to play here. Thank you.
Amazing, thank you. RT, please.
Thanks. I'm tempted to respond to that, but maybe I'll just stick with what I was going to say, which is about who should actually be discussing SRM. It's not a technical issue of, scientifically accessible risks and harms under idealized conditions, and it's one of the most unprecedented geopolitical security challenges facing us. So who should be in the room, actually? Should it be a small group of SRM researchers whose professional mandate it is to explore SRM, or should we be talking to a room full of global security experts, general climate policy experts, global governance scholars, and to broaden the discussion. So I'm very happy, Matthias, that your project is, of course, looking at a particular facet of this question. But I think that is the key challenge, because this planet-altering technology will not land in some idealized world. So thanks.
I find myself nodding vigorously. So thank you, Artie, for that. And finally, Clara.
Yeah, I guess I have two words that I might have said already, which are privilege and humility. So for the next 2 days, I hope we can always acknowledge the privilege that it is to be here, not just in Brussels talking about a technology that has global impacts, but also the privilege of having this knowledge, and then what do we do with this, hence being humble about it as well, knowing about the science and all the very hard governance questions doesn't mean that we know better, especially as we might not be the ones who will be at the front lines of climate change.
Fantastic. I couldn't agree more with pretty much anything in this last round in particular. And so on that note, let's see on the next slide a bit of an outlook to what's next. Actually first, to acknowledge that in the background, this conversation has been tracked visually. And let's make sure that this stays up also during the break. I think we can do that. This is a literal mapping of this conversation, if you will. We'll need to take a moment to take that in. And so we'll come back to this, I think. So briefly, let's show the agenda of what's next on the next slide. To reiterate, you can download the agenda onto your phones using the QR codes on the walls. This is the overview. So just to foreshadow that, after the photo that we'll take in a moment, for those of you who are willing to be on it, we'll have the breakout parallel discussions under Chatham House rules, as shown on the screen. There was some reshuffling of times compared to previous agendas, so make sure you check this one or the one that's online. That's the one that counts. In those breakout sessions, again, there will be note-keeping, visual and textual. There will be a facilitator moderating the conversation, and there will be someone who will report back from these breakouts in the synthesis in the evening. Facilitators, I look at you, you're responsible to make sure that someone is doing that job. It can be you, it can be someone else, but make sure there is someone, because that's quite important, so we can pull together the different strands of the conversation throughout the day as we come back here in the evening. And so without further ado, again, a big hand of applause to the panel. Thank you very much for your contributions. And before you get up, I want to give Chris the word to orchestrate the group photo. That's always a logistical challenge to get everyone in the right spot, so make sure to follow his guidance.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Please stay in the room. We're going to clear probably the mid-section of the room. The photographer's heading up now to that bridge just there, and we'll sort of be taking a photo down on everybody. If the team could start clearing chairs in the middle of the room, we'll make sure there's space for everybody, and the photo will be in the next couple of minutes. Thank you.
Okay, perfect.
So, yeah. That's why I'm going to check.
Do you use the microphone maybe to direct people?
Thank you for the contributions. It was fantastic. I was wondering if I could ask you to, yeah, sorry to interrupt.
Okay. All right. As folks are streaming into the hall, please find a seat. I also encourage you to move to the front. The first 2 rows are reserved for the breakout session rapporteurs. We don't have to be strict about that, but please do move to the front so that you can easily hop on stage in a moment. Someone left their phone upstairs in one of the breakout rooms. If that rings a bell, if you're missing a phone. Otherwise, I'll ask colleagues to get it and serve as a lost and found. All right. I do think we have a critical mass in the room, so I don't want to start too late and drag the session on for too long. It's been a long and hot day, so I think everyone's going to be happy getting towards the end of the discussion, though, as riveting as they have been, at least from my experience. As I said, the breakout session rapporteurs, please do move close to the stage so you have an easy way to come on stage, so we have a very swift turnaround. While that happens, quick housekeeping request. As I'm sure many of you might be tempted to post on social media, LinkedIn, whatever, if you do use pictures, please make sure to check and avoid including anyone whose badge says no pictures. We should be respecting that right and make sure of that. With that, welcome back to the plenary hall after what has been clearly, what I've seen, a very rich and lively day of discussions. The goal of the next 40 minutes is to give everyone a flavor of the type of discussions, the highlights, and the observed perhaps tensions or commonalities in viewpoints observed through these 3 rounds of parallel sessions. So to reduce the fear of missing out, in addition to seeing the visualizations of those discussions displayed on stage as well. This is with a view to perhaps foster a shared and somewhat simplified memory of all that richness of discussion. So for this, we have 2 tools. That sounds pejorative, but rapporteurs that will give very quick highlights in 2 minutes maximum. There's a timer to hold them to account, going to be displayed on the slide. And at the same time, the visual note takers summary of the conversations to further illustrate. That visualization will also feature, as will all other visual note takers, in the conference summary report to be published as quickly as we manage following the conference. Naturally, this will not do justice to the depth of discussion, but hopefully create a sense of the breadth, which might be just as important. And finally, this synthesis will set the stage for the closing panel discussion, which will pick up on some of those themes and put them into further context and reflection by a very eminent set of panelists. I'm very much looking forward to that. That's it. We can jump right in, and I'm going to invite, oh, sorry, actually, one more thing. You may remember in the morning putting a few notes into your phone on the Slido survey on the poll. This is the aggregated result of your statements in regards to the motivations of strengthening research governance. Now, this is highly aggregated, and I do believe we can and probably should include a disaggregated illustration of those answers also in the conference report, making a mental note of that to make sure. But you can clearly see, and this is not in order of the numbers of upvotes, so risk and safety concerns around slippery slope technology development and all that came very high. And then trust and transparency, so ways in which to make sure the research is actually fostering a stronger ability for, I think, governance at large to grapple with the issue of SRM and perhaps by extension climate. And then a few slightly less upvoted ones that are nonetheless clearly important. So with that, let's move on to the rapporteur's synthesis of these 12 sessions. Every one of you probably saw 3 of those, so let's make sure we get the full picture. Let's jump right in. I think, this is the overview. We'll see that again after the individual reports, and as a backdrop to the closing panel as well. Yeah, I think we won't have time to fully take that in, but perhaps you already get an impression. So, I believe we will start with civil society perspectives on the next slide. That's correct, please. Who's the rapporteur for that session?
Okay, yes, so I was note-taking in the civil society perspectives breakout group, and basically the clearest tension in this group concerned whether SRM research itself should continue. So some participants argued that more research is needed to better understand the risks and inform future decisions, especially given worsening climate impacts. But others argued that research is not politically neutral and inevitably contributes to technological development and normalization. So this produced quite a deep disagreement over whether uncertainty justifies further research or instead justifies stopping SRM research now. There was some convergence around that emission reduction should remain a priority, really including global South voices and vulnerable communities. They should be central to the decision making. Current public and institutional understanding of SRM is very limited, but also a broad agreement about transparency and stronger governance is necessary as well. And then several major questions remained unresolved in this session. So a key question was, what is the actual end point of SRM research? What's the point? And can small-scale or modeling research ever truly remain separate from deployment pathways? Who gets to decide? What voices get included and how do they get included? And also what forms of governance could ever be considered legitimate or democratic across our sort of generation, but generations to come as well. And some particularly insightful moments challenge the assumption that science is neutral. So several speakers argued that research itself can shape political futures and governance trajectories as well. And I'll sort of end on the final sort of prominent moment was a statement from one participant who said, we do not have a spare planet to experiment with, which captured this ethical concern that meaningful testing of SRM may only be possible at planetary scale. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
And time. Brilliant. Thank you so much. A quick hand of applause. Thank you. And right to the next one, which is, drumroll, defining research and its boundaries.
All right, thank you. So in 1 minute and 59, I'll try and summarize what we did. So in this session, we did initially a kind of scan of the kinds of research that go into this field before getting into some of the definitions and boundaries between key concepts. So in terms of the types of research, I think as has been mentioned before, the bulk of the research in this field is modeling, which is essential to understanding the potential consequences. That modeling is constrained by our understanding of the systems, and that is improved or constrained by things like observations of natural analogues, some lab work, and potentially by field experiments, which can shine a light on particular aspects of small-scale processes. We talked about the hot topic being SRM field experiments. Crucially, these are defined by intent. The very same activity can be pursued for atmospheric research and fundamental understanding, or framed as a way to better understand potential interventions. So the very same activity, purely by intent, can be labeled differently. Another concept, deployment. Again, you could do this by intent. Some activities are to advance research purposes. Other things like make sunsets efforts to release tiny amounts of material into the stratosphere isn't for research, it's a deployment intent, but the scale is so tiny it has trivial impact. So perhaps in the definition of deployment, you might want to go to scale. Scale for experiments, we often think in terms of, in this field, small-scale experiments today and possible large-scale tomorrow. It's worth recognizing the huge orders of magnitude difference between these small-scale activities of today and the types of scale you need to reach for deployment, which would be, in some cases, millions of times larger. And I think as you go up that scale, from 1 million times smaller to 1,000 times smaller, different types of responsibilities might kick in. And as Ben pointed out, might already kick in some existing regulations at these intermediate scales. Thank you.
That is very much on time. Thank you, Pete. Next up is research ethics and integrity for SRM research governance.
Great, so this was a very varied session, so I'm not going to be able to summarize everything, but the discussion clustered mainly around the adequacy of existing guidelines for SRM research, and also the conditions of stakeholder engagement, although obviously there was a lot of interplay between these two themes. There was broad agreement, I think, that existing guidelines were good as far as they go, but required some further institutionalization. So this was emphasized at two levels. On the one hand, regional specificity, and on the other, degree of bindingness. So some participants emphasized the need for regions to develop regionally contextual guidelines. Others emphasized the need for national commissions to develop legally binding standards, on the model, for example, of the Warnock Committee or the Belmont Report. There was some disagreement on the extent to which existing guidelines were adequate. Some participants argued that we broadly know what the norms of responsible research look like, and the focus now should be building the necessary networks and capacity in institutions to implement them, while others emphasized that there was still need for further clarity at a high level, and this point of clarification before justification. So this involves, for example, prioritizing definitional questions, including the definition of research, the definition of the circumstances in which research is being conducted, including whether it's can be characterized as an emergency, and if research is to be mission-driven, the question of what that mission might be. So I will leave it there, but it was a very lively session, and we had to sadly cut it off in mid-flow.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. Excellent. So next up is the role of knowledge in challenging geopolitical times.
hopefully I can do this justice in 2 minutes. So a lot of our conversation centered around concerns that the question and role of power is frequently disconnected from much of the scientific research, and the infrastructure to address those issues has not really been built. And what architecture there is might be to mobilize that is, if not collapsing, under pressure and going through a process of transformation with unclear implications. And this led to questions about which actors and ministries or departments within them will shape approaches to understanding what SRM is and how to interpret scientific research. So for 2 of our speakers, they highlighted that within the institutions or states that they work, the environmental ministries have minimal engagement or even resistance to engaging, and engagement comes from defense or risk perspectives, which also comprehends more than climate risks and security. And this led to another key part of our discussion, which was centered around research and analysis surfacing that climate is not the only or even the central governance issue with SRM. Questions of technological sovereignty, control, whether this is of material capacity needed for SAI, etc., or political claims of control over technology can quickly become central questions for states that must negotiate international governance. All of this raised questions about how important transparency and potentially public funding are, as well as bilateral and coalitional relationship building to avoid or prepare for non-ideal SRM. But it was very much an open question about how to ensure these things in the context of low trust international political instability, and actors who are resistant to governance or transparency, whether these are powerful state actors or private actors. So I will stop there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Next up, transparency of research, rationales, and challenges.
Thank you, folks. So transparency was, unsurprisingly, not treated as a single process, but a constellation of practices, openness of purpose, funding, methods, oversight, uncertainty, conclusions. Transparency is necessary but not sufficient. It can support trust, accountability, legitimacy, etc., but only when coupled with other practices such as meaningful engagement. Transparency should begin early, before activities or decisions are locked in through, for example, clear summaries, open calls, and accessible explanations. 4th point, intent matters. People want to know not just who and what, but why. For whom, for whose benefit, at whose cost, under whose authority. Practical challenges exist and remain. SRM, for example, is hard to classify, especially when you look at the boundaries with other scientific activities. Likewise, how does one define outdoor experiment? This is a conversation that's been going on within Co-Create to quite some degree. Even something what seems as clear as transparency of funding can be difficult, but public funding has clear obligations of reporting, philanthropic funding, and especially private investment less so. Transparency can backfire. Disclosure of data without context can become mere transparency theater, and information can be misunderstood or misused. Even concerns were raised around harassment, personal safety, and exposing local communities who are involved in engagement. 2 more points. Can I do it? Monitoring is another transparency tool. Satellites and observation systems can help detect activities, but current systems are patchy and not designed for SRM. Ultimately, responsible transparency must be practical, contextual, and reciprocal, not just disclosure, but making research accountable and understandable. Thanks.
Excellent. Just a hair over time, still acceptable. Next up, societal perceptions and inclusive deliberation on SRM research governance.
Hi. I'll try to give that justice. We had different contributions from people who are either doing this for engagement or researching public perceptions and engagement. And the broad things, if you do engagement today, a lot of it was felt is more for capacity building, so to enable people to speak about it, but also to build the trust and the relationships, to also have continued engagement, which often clashes with research projects and the timelines of research projects and the time and effort researchers can give into that. What might raise some contradiction from colleagues in the project is that we also found there's a lot there that is not specific to SAI or any other SRM. So trust is always important in any kind of interaction. It's got trust in governments, and also conspiracy theories. The ones who've driven conspiracy theories, for example, in the US, and driven the legislation on the state level, are often those who come from the anti-vaxxers or the anti-G5 communities. So there's an underlying thing that's just jumping also upon weather or climate modification. So these are things that are already there, but what's also already there is there are ethics guidelines, and there are guidelines for decolonial research that can be used, that we can draw back onto. So it's not an empty space. But an important thing is something that you also might feel at this time of the day in this heat is fuzziness. Because a lot of questions that come up from participants in deliberations is, why is it important for me? Why should I spend my time engaging? And what will be the impacts on me, my family, my region, my climate, my regional climate? And often, or most of the times, we cannot answer these questions. So we have to keep them hanging a bit. And it makes it a lot more difficult to engage and build an opinion and say yes to this or no to this. I can see you and I'm done. But the fuzziness also came up in others. And who's next?
Thank you. Scientific and technical criteria for SRM research governance.
Yeah, thank you. So the evaluation of SRM field research should be integrated in governance through clear scientific criteria. And so we talked about these different criteria, and we found criteria that are actually common to any scientific research, especially experimental research. And we discussed about these, such as measurability. So we need to be able to measure the things that we want to measure, of course. We need to be able to implement these experiments in a way that they can actually achieve their goals, so respond to the scientific questions that they are supposed to address. And these are very common to all scientific research. And then we discussed 3 points that are also common a bit more in detail, such as, of course, scientific merit came up in the discussions from different viewpoints. So these should aim at improving our understanding of the processes that are at play, that are small scale, and that the global models that we use very often cannot describe specifically. And so this model experiment nexus exists, and meaning that these experiments should be also, their results should be, we should be able to integrate them in the models, and the models should be ready to use this information that we acquire possibly from these experiments, and the scientific questions should be very clear. There was slight tension on whether SRM research should be mission-driven or curiosity-driven, actually. So if there should be a kind of a roadmap of prioritized scientific questions that research should address in a kind of a sequential order or not. Stage gates or exit ramps were also addressed, and this is related to risk assessment, which is very interesting also from a research funder point of view. So what are the risks of these experiments should be defined beforehand or assessed beforehand. And transparency, just like was discussed by Jesse a while ago, it was even said that transparency should be radical for SRM. So transparency of research, full access to all data, model pipelines, and clear communication of the goals. So this really, there's a link between what was said just before. So this all applies to kind of, all scientific research, but the detail that came up is that the specificity of SRM is the need for social license. So transparency, including diverse audiences in the discussion from the beginning, and taking democratic decisions on the topic. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Next up, SRM research, risks, benefits, and governance analogues.
So, thank you very much. So we had a very interesting broad discussion about different lessons we can learn from other sectors, including everything from nuclear power to biomedicine. And so we talked about different lessons that can be learned from these examples. So I would like to leave you with two sort of lessons. So let's say anticipate and regulate. So what should we anticipate? Well, we should try and design governance before absolute crisis hits, right? We shouldn't wait for tragedy to strike before we start thinking about how we might need to use a given technology. Thus the importance potentially of something like mission-driven research. Anticipate power differentials. So good intentions aren't enough in designing governance. So Florencia Luna gave us a really, very interesting example of the COVAX mechanism in COVID-19 pandemic that basically failed, even though we had good scientific evidence, good intentions, and international governance to help it work, but it didn't. Also anticipate a multitude of risks from these other examples, from the physical to the political. And then finally, regulate. So back up principles with a kind of enforcement. So an example from the biomedical field is the legal framework that accompanied the Belmont report, and that led not the principles to be accompanied with enforceable actions that meant that ultimately a common language was proposed in terms of principles, and principalism has triumphed in medical ethics for good or bad. So that's an important lesson, to get principles into the way we think about and behave. Regulate private actors, particularly rogue ones. So that should be part of that idea of enforcing principles. And that's pretty much it, really. So yeah, thank you very much.
Even ahead of time. Thank you. Finally, not sure if finally, actually, narratives and scenarios of SRM research.
SRM. Okay, so with an interesting conversation about scenarios and narratives, mainly coming from really different perspectives. So if there's one sort of main takeaway is that everybody approaches the concept itself of scenario and their generation from sort of wherever they're coming from, right? So we heard about it from sort of a social science perspective and partly a climate science perspective, from a government perspective, from a security perspective, and sort of from a media perspective. And in all of those cases, what constitutes a scenario and what constitutes a useful scenario are really widely different things. One thing that I'd like to highlight is that whenever you end up talking about scenarios, you sort of end up in this paradox where everybody wants multiple things that tend to have some sort of tension. In particular, some of the ones that were highlighted during the discussion was the fact that on one hand, there's plausibility. We want our scenarios to be plausible, but also we want to explore the extremes, the least likely things, or maybe just the way out there things, but also what's extreme or what's unlikely might change over time. So something that you explore now and it doesn't sound like it's ever gonna happen, it might be way more likely or perceived as being way more likely 20 years from now. Same thing, sort of, on one hand, there's the need for simplicity in the scenarios from especially a scientific perspective to disentangle and understand. But on the other hand, people might prefer sort of more complex scenarios that yield a bit more holistic insight about all of the things, because things in the real world change all the time, all at once. And lastly, there might be a tension between being inclusive in the design of those scenarios versus sort of lacking some specificity. So ultimately, the main question always remains, who are the scenarios for? And understanding clearly who are the scenario being produced for also helps with sort of solving some of those tensions.
On the dot. Incredible.
It's my only skill, basically.
Perspectives on responsible SRM research in the Arctic.
Okay, so this is the session on perspectives on responsible SRM in the Arctic, which was led by Ilona, who started the session by saying what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic, which was I thought was quite a good introduction. We've got two themes going on across our presentations and questions. Firstly, around physical science, and secondly, around indigenous perspectives. And then we've got a number of recommendations for our co-create guidelines. So in terms of physical science, we had a number of options for the Arctic, in particular introduced around sea ice thickening, marine cloud brightening and cirrus cloud thinning and stratospheric aerosols. all of which have seem to have varying levels of promise and feasibility, all of which are, to some extent, speculative, with sea ice thickening maybe likely to work locally, but overall being the most speculative option. Marine cloud brightening having a moderate feasibility, but with the modeling being very uncertain. Cirrus cloud thinning kind of being one of the new kids on the block, being quite highly speculative, but could work well potentially. Stratospheric aerosols, of course, is suggested as being one of the most highly feasible. But of course, all of these are operating in a region that's highly sensitive to changes in radiative forcing, which makes all of this very uncertain. So yeah, Arctic SRM wouldn't definitely work, but field experiments would certainly help with increasing our understanding of them. Indigenous perspective, oh God, indigenous perspectives, we talked about the Sami, raising questions of political agency, and what would need to happen for the Sami to give the green light on experiments. Most participants in research tend to be skeptical. There are particular concerns around human and animal health, and a lot of it's oriented around traditional livelihoods, which underpin much of their perspectives, in particular around subsistence living, for example, fisheries. We have a number of recommendations, but I won't go into them now.
Excellent, thank you. Mind the Gap, SRM across the science policy interface. There's a mic there, I think. It's still there.
Hi, it was a very interesting discussion from Mind the Gap SRM research across the science policy interface. One of the central themes that came across is that trust and communication is very, very important when it comes to science and policy discussion. It also highlights the need for scientists and policymakers to better communicate uncertainties, risks, and assumption while improving mutual understanding of language, framing, as you can see, and institutional realities. There was a lot of reflections on the difficulty of translating complex scientific knowledge into policy-relevant communications, and especially within short political time frames. The importance of storytelling, communicating subtle facts, avoiding oversimplification was emphasized. There was extensive discussion around global governance and experimentation, and also the conversation explored the role of risk perception and framing. Another major theme was the challenge of building consensus and legitimacy across regions and sector when it comes to science policy interfaith-related communication. Participants also noted the importance of including global South perspectives, acknowledging skepticism around international collaboration, and ensuring that governance discussions are not dominated by narrow set of actors. Finally, it's also captured the recurring tension between urgency and caution, how to create space for responsible research governance while recognizing fear around loss of control, defense and security implications, and broader societal concerns. So that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Ahead of time. Excellent. Thank you so much. Principles for SRM research, history, purpose, and limits.
I'm the one also doing that one. So the previous session I moderated, and this one I was a rapporteur for this. So just a minute, please. So one of the central themes that emerged from the principles aspect is that principles alone are not enough. Implementation and enforcement matters equally. While there is already a broad landscape of SRM governance principles and ethical frameworks, there was repeated conversation on that many remain largely aspirational without much of institutional backing, operational guidance, and meaningful compliance mechanism. There was also diverse perspectives in our room on how these principles should be actually operationalized in practice, And it became clear that reaching consensus on concrete next steps going forward is quite challenging. A second takeaway was that SRM governance cannot rely on one-size-fits-all kind of model. Participants stressed that importance of context-specific and multidisciplinary approaches that bring together legal, ethical, political, scientific, and societal perspectives. There was also recognized that governance reality differs significantly across domestic, regional, and international contexts, and making flexibility and inclusivity essential for responsible governance. So finally, the session was talking and highlighting the increasingly important role that non-state governance actors can play, including funders, research institutions, scientific communities, in shaping norm and encouraging responsible conduct. At the same time, speakers were also emphasizing that voluntary principles and self-governance mechanism cannot replace broader democratic legitimacy, legal oversight, and public accountability. That was the sense of the conversation of ours. Thanks.
Amazing, and thank you for taking the burden of reporting on 2 sessions. Very fitting. So here, we have the overview here, and I have a feeling I will want to go back to this recording, and in fact, you can also do that on the Climate Strategies YouTube website. You can find the recording of this recap and of the other panel sessions, just as a reminder. So with that, I want to invite my fellow panelists for this closing panel, the final part of today, except for dinner, which follows afterwards. I will, please do make your way forward. First, we have Olivia Lazard from the Berggruen Institute. I will let everyone introduce themselves because they will do so much better in regards to the context in which we're having this conversation. Next, David Awolala with the African Group of Negotiators Expert Support, AGNES. Is David here? Maybe, if not, that might be due to the fact that we have rolled up the timing a little bit on this closing panel, so we might have to start without him if that is the case, but I'm sure he will join us shortly. Then we have Julia Guivant, if I'm saying that right, hopefully, from the Federal University of Santa Catarina in Brazil. And finally, Jeroen Omen from Utrecht University. Welcome. So I will not waste a lot of time to scene set for this panel because I think the speakers will speak for themselves, first of all, and really do a much better job at connecting dots. I think there was a lot that we heard in this synthesis, in this recap of really thoughtful discussion being summarized in a very short amount of time. Some of you might have participated in some of those discussions as well. And just to set the scene very briefly then, this is not to wrap up everything that we heard or that was discussed, the issue of research governance into solar radiation modification research. Instead, I really have high hopes that our brilliant speakers will connect dots of the discussions today with broader policy contexts, both in Europe and elsewhere, and doing so based on their own perspective, their experiences, work in different fields, and again, connecting perhaps the academic world with the world of policy. Yeah, I think I will invite you, Olivia, to just get things going. Give us some of your thoughts here.
Thanks, Matthias. Good afternoon, everyone. You guys covered a lot of ground, so it's very, very difficult to sort of react and rebound in a way that synthesizes a lot of different points that you guys brought up and surfaced. But the way that I tend to think about the question of SRM and geoengineering at large is essentially that we are facing the potential of a threshold technology. If we start intervening in atmospheric systems, something that we have done, which has created externalities, but we've never done it with design before. We've never done it with a sense of, we will try and control some elements of planetary systems, Earth systems that we don't yet fully understand, but which start posing increasing risks towards us. The problem is that obviously if we head towards this scenario of threshold technology, we don't exactly know indeed what we need to govern for. We don't understand fully what we need to look out for, and we don't know what's on the other side of this. And particularly with certain forms of SAI, we may be facing indeed certain types of really long-term dependencies that raise fundamental questions of access, governance, and feasibility to maintain the systems of interference within atmospheric systems over time. And I think that it sort of rebounds quite nicely on this notion, and that was raised in a number of discussions around what is the endpoint and what is the role of SAI or SRM. Is it even going to be in relation to climate systems, or is it indeed a co-product of security dilemmas which are now playing over the fourth industrial revolution, which is the way that I tend to look at SRM. Because at the moment, what we're facing is essentially a situation in which SRM itself and any type of geoengineering writ large is now becoming a function of expansion of energy systems and technological race to AI and AGI. And on this, and I know that I don't have a lot of time, but I think it's worth, I'm sure that you guys have had plenty of discussions during the day about this. But on this, I just want to introduce something else. I think that a lot of us here are indeed approaching SRM with this notion of like, what kind of threshold technology is it? I think that there are some other people, particularly in the private sector, particularly coming from VCs, and particularly coming from Silicon Valley, who are approaching the SRM as a hedging technology, as a way to essentially sort of place bets on planetary futures upon which they're sort of planting flags already. They understand better than anyone that we've entered indeed the age of planetary security, and as a result, they're essentially sort of trying to look at a bunch of different technological innovations, including SRM, as a way to accelerate towards AGI, which they consider absolutely foundational to the future of tech-enabled human evolution and post-planetary exits. So all of a sudden, the moment that we start looking at SRM in this light, the stakes become completely different. And I think that if we start looking at it this way, it becomes essentially a civilizational wager. We're not talking about governance understood as a technical, technocratic regulation aspect. We're talking about a vision for humanity and for the planet in the future, which is the timelines to think about how to meet those futures is becoming shorter and shorter because of tech accelerationism and because of climate accelerationism. So I think that parts of the roles of the EU in particular, European actors, as well as any nation state and civil society actor that does not subscribe to the type of planetary futures that people using SRM as a hedging technology want, the role is essentially to close the space for SRM to be used essentially as a hedging technology in the future. And that demands indeed doing a bunch of different things, which I think the EU is starting to invest into. But one of the primary things I think that needs to be instigated is indeed making sure that the space for commodification of SRM, commercial SRM, does not exist. and that sort of needs to include countering any type of advances towards IP secrecy, demanding any type of chemical, formula related to SRM to be disclosed. If possible, to sort of try to include elements of governance that prohibit patent applications towards SRM. Make sure that within the EU taxonomy, SRM is considered as something that should not receive any funding, that is not sustainable. And also making sure that within trade negotiations, or any type of negotiations on the basis of power dynamics today and security cooperation, SRM, especially commercial SRM, is not included as something that deserves particular attention from an investment perspective. And in fact, deserves a lot more regulation and a lot more governance alliances around how to approach indeed the concept of SRM regulation and governance in the future. I'll stop there for now. I'm sure there will be questions afterwards.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Olivia, indeed. And a pleasure and an honor to also welcome David Avolala on the panel. Apologies if the shift we made caused a challenge. And in fact, I would very much like to hand you the word to also perhaps explore from your perspective. I think we heard a lot during the day about the need to be aware of context, regional context, the way knowledge is being produced, that it is responsive to the needs that also decision makers have, which I think very much fits your professional context with the African group of negotiators expert support. So feel free to take it away, your reflections, very much appreciated.
Okay, thanks, Matthias. For me, it's an honor to be in the room today to listen to various comments of SRM researchers, experts, also some policymakers who are interested in this conversation. And the issues of risk, safety, transparency have been reoccurring, and that of open engagement. So I see that there's that willingness to look for legitimacy platform through which SRM technologies could be much more made open in terms of increasing the knowledge about the technologies that could also dovetail into policy processes. Coming from a region where we have less technology capacity, because most of the technologies are coming from the north, and the Souths are skeptical about what is the agenda. So I would support an opinion that there should be co-creation of technology, governance issues that surrounds SRM. And SRM researchers should think beyond research questions, because we do not want SRM researchers to be conducting research because they want to solve questions that are interesting to them as researchers, but do we also have policy questions? So there is a kind of a feedback mechanism that should flow between the scientists and the policymakers. The policymakers need trustworthy evidence that can make them to make informed decisions. And when you look at the timeline of research, sometimes some of the projections we have are into the future, long-term projections. And what do we incentivize? Researchers want to make publications. You want groundbreaking, outputs, result outputs. But policymakers need specific information that can make them to make quick decisions. And if they should make bad decisions, they risk what we call reputational risk. And so for Africa, we want a capacity to be built. We want to design the research and policy agenda together. And in terms of the governance, we want a structure that every region will be seen as part of the equal agenda setter, rather than region where you want to You see them as impact regions where you want to dump, let me use the word, to dump technologies or some of these emerging climate interventions. So, but if we feel that those who are advanced in technology can take a reverse side and let these other regions come out from regional context issues that looks at SRM interventions, not in isolation, but as part of the box of many other climate responses, then we can say, okay, SRM is part of the solutions, but not specifically a one-time fix-all solution.
Thank you so much indeed. There are already, I think, some commonalities emerging that this issue is particular in many ways, and yet it needs to be grappled with within the processes at hand, the institutions at hand that are in place to deal with both with the knowledge production and then with the policy that needs to build or connect to that. So this is really I think fitting with a lot of discussions as well that we heard throughout the day. Yeah, so I'll continue the first round and invite Julia, please, to share your reflections. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthias. First, I would like to thank Co-Create for organizing this dynamic forum and so rich with ideas and food for thought in the future. And one tension that stay with me is the difference between communicating SRM and governing SRM, research responsibly. We often ask how SRM can be explained to different publics, because SRM is, well, as we have seen today, it's very complex, politically sensitive, and mainly not very easy to communicate. But I think the governance question is broader, because it's not only whether people understand SRM, it's also where SRM fits within different ideas of climate responsibility. And this and in this, I bring my reflection to my own research. I am an environmental sociologist in Brazil, in southern Brazil, and my current research is being done and funded by Degrees, the social fund in Degrees, and I have been interviewing with my team 25 until now, 25 top climatologists that are very well connected internationally. Many are involved in the IPCC and in other global scientific networks. What we found now is there is not simple a division between who is in favor or who is against SRM, but we found like a spectrum of positions among these top climatologists, and with different degrees of distance, caution, pragmatic openness, and concern. The distance should not be read, I think, simply as lack of information, because many of these scientists had some kind of familiarity with SRM. So they, knowing what is SRM, more or less, they are not experts in the issue, they consider that is a secondary issue and some not neither a plan B or plan C, almost, because we found that among the majority, the moral hazard was the most important point. And so reducing emissions, protecting the Amazon, understanding climate impacts, and addressing vulnerability in already exposed areas are priorities. And so the question is, how can we integrate researchers from other parts of the world in this kind of discussions and not only, as you mentioned, David, not only in the perspective of capacity building, but in the case of researchers in the perspective of capacity sharing, how to include them in modeling, for example, because they are experts in their areas, and so the challenge, I think, is how to communicate with them the importance of doing or considering SRM among other priorities in relation to climate change. So the distance they have in relation to SRM is not only can not only be understood as ignorance, it's a distance that we call epistemic distance, because this is rooted, as in spite they are in, these scientists are in international networks, they have some kind of principles that are shared in their climate, let's say, community research. So they share some principles about what is going to be funded, how to write calls for research, because they have, these are interesting scientists as well, because they have well contact with the ministries, although they can change with the governments, but they are very well respected among the bureaucrats, let's say, in the different ministries. And so these are key people, let's say, to speak with and to include. And it's not only, I reinforce this idea because we are speaking a lot about participation, public engagement, but who is going to be engaged, how, when? We have all these questions that have been signaled in the synthesis, and we are not speaking enough about other researchers in another parts of the world, that is not only the other part of the world, is the global south. No, I think that many of us agree that it's not possible to speak about as an homogeneous global south. It's very, very complex and heterogeneous. So how can, that's a challenge, I think, for the debate tomorrow, for the labs that I'm looking forward, and I think it's a very creative idea that all the group is having to present us with that space. And so not only how to discuss this issue with different kind of populations, groups, etc., stakeholders, let's say, but also with scientists that don't want to be only included, want maybe to be sharing their own capacity and their own priorities with other scientists in defining the agenda in relation to SRM and situated in the context of the discussion on climate change. That is, of course, the priority. Thank you.
Excellent, and also thank you for foreshadowing tomorrow's discussions and for, I think, several points in regards to the fact that we, well, the we actually matters, the institutions, the actors who get to shape the research agenda and direction thereof, and that this is this is not a question that can be determined in blanket statements, but it's one that really is depending on the region, the nation, and the institutional landscapes is also what I'm hearing. Yeah, excellent. So last but not least, let's hear it from Jeroen, please.
Yeah, thank you. And also thank you, Olivia, for biting off a bunch of really big questions, so now I don't have to feel awkward for doing the same, for not being immediately pragmatic. But I wanted to start with a little bit of a confusion that I've been feeling for the past 24 or so hours since I've arrived in this venue. And I think, whenever you go to a conference, there's basically 2 or multiple conferences going on at the same time, right? You have the formal program and you have the informal conversations at the coffee table. And I don't think I've ever been to a space where the disjuncture between the two felt so strong. Because I think when Clara this morning said, well, it feels like we've been having the same conversations for 7 years, I feel like we've rehearsed this conversation that we've had today, at least the public conversation, a lot. And it's just, we're stuck in the same questions that we try to answer. But at the same time, when I'm at the coffee tables, I hear a lot of, well, let's just call it what it is, scary shit, happening outside of the purview of our typical conversation, right? And I've just been thinking about this quote the whole day that I'm going to read to you, and I'm sure all the Americans will know it, especially if you're a little bit older, because it was a really big thing back in the day, but it's from the George Bush era. It's attributed to Karl Rove, and he at some point told a journalist that journalist was living in what we call the reality-based community. A community that believes that solutions emerge from judicious study of discernible reality. And then he went on saying, well, but that's not really the way the world works anymore. We're an empire now. And when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality, judiciously as you will, we'll act again, create other new realities, which you can study too. And that's how things sort out. And I feel like sort of we're stuck in being that reality-based community a little bit. We have this whole conversation about what is SRM, what is responsible research, how to define justice in this context. Well, this reality out there, this political reality that I've really not heard spoken about on stage as much as you just did, until you just did, is so fundamentally important to what is happening right now in SRM. And I think one of the things, there are many things that I could bite off here, chew off, and I want to just do one example around the question, okay, who are the actors in this space? Right? Because I think one of the things that I said this morning in my panels, I think this field is quite ahistorical and apolitical in the way that it's configured. And one of the things that it doesn't realize is that a lot of the actors that we self-evidently attribute agency to, and I'm taking the nation state now as an example, are historically contingent. And the amount of power that they have is historically contingent. And so this whole debate grew up in a time where there was a self-evidence to a liberal world order that just isn't there anymore. And I think the VC example is the most pertinent example because it's been coming up so much. It's not just a hedging technology. It's also that you see a changing configuration of state versus capital power, where you get now Palantir in the security space or SpaceX in the spacefaring space, taking up a role that would typically, historically, have been a state role. Right? So it is a state-private symbiosis. Well, it's a symbiosis only for the people who are in the sort of VC world, but they're taking over state functions. Now, we could also try to imagine maybe this is what Stardust is hedging for. Right? And this is just one of the examples. So how do we think about responsible research in a space where the world is changing this much, right? Especially, as Arti said this morning, if we're talking about a multi-decadal, multi-generational thing, the categories that we use today to understand where agency is will not be the same even 5 years from now, let alone 50 years from now. So what does that mean for how we think about that? I'll stop there because I could do this for hours.
Thanks, Jeroen. And I want to say, yeah. Thanks to all the speakers, in fact, so far, that I think there are these pockets where these topics are coming up, and also there is a reason why both of you are on stage right now, because I see this topic, this realization growing in the academic world as regards SRM research, that the context, power, changes in the world are absolutely things that need to be featuring in these conversations. And I think that is a nice segue to a question I think I can pose to all four of you, which is, in light of these developments and in light of the struggle, I would say, the fact, as Jeroen says, that there has been this conversation that seems to have been stuck and kind of the same over 10 years. What does that mean in terms of where there are actors that do hold sway, that do hold relevance still, or you know, governments do have a relevance, so the nation state is not entirely undermined, but and we also have to be mindful of where this conversation is happening. It's the conversation that's happening at the intersection between academia and policy, primarily research policy, as per the design, I think, of the project, but it's increasingly also a conversation that is acknowledging these boundary conditions and this broader context. So given all that, what are some of the most concrete levers that the different institutions or organizations either within you operate or that you are seeing in the broader landscape could be used by those entities in order to make an incremental improvement? Because after all, there's no switch to land in an ideal world. But I think we all have to operate on the assumption that things can be made incrementally better by deliberate efforts that are thoughtful and acknowledging of the context in which we operate. So what are some of the most concrete avenues of action that you can share with us today to improve the conditions and the research governance given these challenges? Is that a question that you can grapple with? And perhaps we go in reverse order, starting with Jeroen. Is that? So I know you don't like, I'm quoting you from Cape Town, you don't like to talk about solutions, but is there an action?
Well, I was really hoping that I wouldn't be the first, at least. Well, I think one part of it is also looking internally to our own debate and just recognizing in the many ways in which we are also pawns in other people's games, right? And just understanding those games and have a very serious conversation about that. The other thing is, of course, the power of the nation state and even the power of investigative journalism. It hasn't disappeared, it's not gone. We're just in a phase of reconstitution. But we all have to play our part in keeping that alive, potentially, if that's what we want. And I think, so for me, the incrementalism is really about how do it's not about SRM anymore. And I think and you also said it in your introduction, and that there's something special about SRM, and sure, there is something special about SRM in the intent of deliberately modifying the Earth's systems. It's not, I mean, there are other technologies that do that too, but maybe not at this scale. But by insisting on how different this is, we risk having the conversation just about SRM. And so for me, the things where I think, well, what can we do to make the world or this conversation incrementally better? Well, it's really about, well, let's talk about the power that VCs have in general. Let's talk about big tech in general. Let's make sure that we have a much more mature conversation about what we can and cannot do with science in society. Because a lot of the controversy and a lot of the polarization within the field, and I think also on the topic outside of the field, is just because there's a lot of misunderstanding of what science is and can be in society. So, I mean, I said to Herman before this, I'm the wrong person to ask this kind of question, because I think on 30 or 50-year timescales, right? So I don't know what to do tomorrow. I'm thinking, how do we set up a cultural movement around this?
Julia.
Okay. I don't agree so much with the idea that we are so much stuck in the same discussion. I think it's important to have these discussions about public engagement, about who, when, what, etc. All these questions, because I think that social scientists, speaking as one, we have, I think, arrived to this discussion about SRM quite recently. And the experts in SRM, modeling, etc., climatologists that are working on SRM, have not assumed an interdisciplinary perspective, maybe, no? So I think that the interdisciplinary dialogue is not exhausted already. There is much space to occupy, to develop, and we are doing that. No, I feel glad that I am a social scientist working with social studies of science, environmental sociology, etc. I'm participating and listening and having these different talks, no, in the coffee breaks, etc. So, and there is a lot to be working still on these issues. To be pragmatic about this issue is very important, not to be repeating the idea of a public engagement, for example, because that's not, we can't be romantic about this idea. We need to be very realistic of the limits that not everybody would like to participate, not everybody would like to, is motivated to be engaged. And sometimes who wants to be engaged are people that have their own agenda. So we need to be careful about that. No, who is going to participate? Who is going to be involved? And, but I agree that the geopolitical landscape is very, very uncertain. And it's very dangerous, it's very conflictive, and we don't have the same multilateral countries negotiations spaces that we had before. And so this is a challenge for governance. Who is going to govern this? Which is the institution? Which is the forum? I think that is really difficult to see, no? Which are the big structures that are going to be doing that. And so I think that, of course, we need to be careful, and the plans can't be for a long term, although there is the need to think in the long term, but things are changing a lot. And one of the sessions I was today was about narratives, and I don't remember her name, but this journalist was from Switzerland. I don't know if she's here now, and she mentioned that and asked, I think it was her that asked in another session, the role of fake news in as the media. It's so important today, and the role of because when we say no, nobody knows about SRM, it's not quite correct, because we have Instagram groups, for example, or Facebook groups, etc., about chemtrails in Brazil with more than 4,000 followers. And these are global networks speaking about chemtrails. And so I think that as well, that's we are not speaking in an empty space, and we are speaking in a conflictive and diverse and very uncertain world. But that doesn't mean we need to be paralyzed about how to reply to this.
Yeah, I think one theme that I'm hearing in this, in perhaps between Jeroen's and Julia's responses, is that we have also a bit of a clash between an ideal, sort of an idealist approach, if I can put it that way, in describing governance ideals on the one end, how this whole issue should be tackled, and then on the other end, quote-unquote reality, or just a much more complex landscape of real institutions, actors, individuals coming together and co-creating in here, but also more broadly interacting. And this is a much more messy picture that I think it's important to acknowledge, that we have these two poles oftentimes, this abstract and the real world. And I do think that there is movement. So I see many of these points. So yeah, over to you, David, please.
Okay, for me, I see two pathways to improvement. From developing country perspective, in order to not to see SRM interventions as distraction, there's a need to have a community of practice. Why do I say some felt SRM is a distraction? Developing countries, they have certain expectations from global north regarding their international climate commitments. In developing countries currently, there is so huge climate change literacy. I mean, climate change illiteracy, rather, is so wide compared to your own region. Because I heard you said you have large community where you're on Instagram and you share information, which is super good. But in many developing countries, we don't have that. There are still a lot of misconception about what is climate change. And now we are going a little bit higher, talking about things that are even beyond either adaptation or mitigation. So poverty, issues of loss and damage, technology transfer, capacity building, and climate finance are the priority for many developing countries. So how can we bring in the conversation of SRM interventions to address some of these issues? For example, what would be the cost of SRM deployment, the technologies? What are the benefits? Who gains from such technologies? Who control the benefits? In terms of permission to deploy, who owns the rights to permit deployment? These are issues that can easily be addressed when we have a community of practice. So right from designing interventions, why can't we have the scientists in the room, the practitioners, the private sector, the policymakers, as well as the policy takers as well, who are perhaps vulnerable, marginalized communities? Why can't we have an open engagement where we can co-design some of these ideas? And secondly, the second pathway is about data sharing. And I might want to say something that maybe my colleague might react to since he comes from UCT. Do we really think about issues of ESG principles, ESS principles in SRM research? Because these are issues of citizen science that should be bothering to us. And so in most of the data gathering, scenario developments that most of the SRM experts have been conducting, the question is, who owns the data? Do different regions have access? Do they have control on what they do with the data? You see? So currently, we do not have sufficient information about the economic assessment of SRM technologies. We don't have it. Either economic modeling and the risk assessment, the environmental impact assessment studies, do we have them? We don't. So we still have a long way to go. But if we can follow this path, for us from developing countries, it's really important to us. And these are issues that can strengthen the trust between the policy and research, because currently there's a disconnection. Policymakers are doing their own thing in silos. Researchers are also, moving forward with their groundbreaking scientific discoveries, which is fine. But the research outputs, are they responding to the needs of the society, the needs of the policymakers, who are the ones to take decision? Scientists would not take decision on deployments. It is the policy that takes decision. And for them to take decision, they need credible evidence that are grounded regionally and that are open to explain risk and benefits.
Thank you. And Olivia, please jump right in. Thanks.
I want to acknowledge that we're having two parallel conversations on the panel. And I think it's important to recognize this in order to have a mental model that allows us to address the various sort of questions that come from these two discussions. I think that what Jeroen and me are trying to bring up is that there is a mobilization of actors with tremendous capabilities in financial, political, military, economic, cultural, information terms that are now actively entering, have been entering the space regarding geoengineering conversations. And geoengineering is situated on their maps within a larger project. It is not an end in and of itself, it's a means towards a greater end. That end is the civilizational project that I was talking about, which is about going beyond the confines of the planetary. Those actors recognize planetary boundaries. They understand planetary boundaries. Those actors have access to tremendous modeling capabilities. And they understand, it's even in their discourse, if you hear a person like Peter Thiel, his entire ideology hinges on the notion of entropy and stagnation, which needs to be fought against. And fighting against entropy, including at planetary level, includes accelerating, providing and giving every single means in terms of investments towards technological innovations that will take humanity, not necessarily humans as we understand them today, as we've been understanding humanity for the last 12,000 years. The project is to create a different kind of humanity which not everyone has access to, and which not everyone will evolve towards. And parts of the future of civilization, the way that they understand it, will maybe stay on this planet, or maybe will evolve towards something completely different. Think of singularity rhetorics or narratives coming from Kurzweil. Think of extraterrestrial conquests, like, a la Elon Musk. Elon Musk, who has mused about geoengineering, space-based geoengineering, or Altman, who's in charge of the Stargate project, who has also mused about geoengineering, again, as a technology that helps to gain time in order to evolve towards AGI, so that AGI helps humanity evolve towards a different dimension of its history, of its biological evolution. The other conversation that David and Julia are bringing up, in which like a lot of different panels or groups have been discussing, have to do with a conversation about SRM, which has been historically tethered to the climate conversation and to how to manage climate risks. Knowing that a lot of previous steps regarding, or before essentially considering the deployment, the research, but potential deployment of SRM, such as how to navigate transition risks, how to navigate derailment risks, have not been had. So we're incredibly late, essentially, in terms of how do we even try to create governance systems, mapping exercises, alliances that help us to understand how to accelerate towards an energy transition and more largely climate-related transitions that are effective, right? But on the thing that I think connects the two is the notion of, if there is a civilizational wager on the one hand, coming from techno-accelerationists, who, by the way, are also techno-fascists, if there is a civilizational wager coming from them, the question is, what is the alternative? What is the other vision for the future of the planetary? Knowing that the future involves essentially some kind of equilibrium, some kind of balance, not just between nation states, which are increasingly being hollowed out, as you were saying, Jeroen, and which are being transformed by climate change, by anthropogenic change, by economic change, by technological change, and which are now being reconfigured into central stacks. This is the operating word for the US and for China, which are essentially driving us towards a fundamental redesign of the geopolitical and geostrategic system. So in this context, where we have a fundamental redesign of geostrategic systems, what do polities such as the EU or nation states like Brazil, which are facing debt issues and therefore investment issues and therefore competition issues, how do they position themselves? Not just against this other project. What do they stand for? How do they align in terms of alliances? What do they discuss? Why is SRM important to discuss within, for example, the context of mineral partnerships between, for example, the EU and Brazil, or EU and Norway, or EU and Canada? How does talking about SRM help us understand the new geostrategic context that we have to navigate, and therefore that we need to defend ourselves from, knowing that in any case, the notion of the nation state is probably not going to stick around for that much longer, because everything is changing anyways. So the question is not about maintaining policies that they have existed, but how we can essentially adapt and what role, if any, SRM plays. And on this, and I'll just finish there, when we talk about SRM, my experience is that it quickly moved indeed in the last 10 years from a solution of last resort to something which is now considered potentially an enabling technology for CDR to scale, for the energy transition to scale, for all of these different things, right? But I don't see any other technical proposition in terms of alternatives. However, what we're not giving enough credit to, and where indeed modeling and planetary sapiens can help, and the EU is extremely well positioned to cooperate with countries like Brazil, with African countries, with other middle powers. I know that this word is contested, but I'll use it just for now. How do we work on complex regeneration? How do we work on understanding better planetary interdependencies, ecological interdependencies within and between ecosystems? How does that, create a new visual map, a new geopolitical map of what we need to invest into, how we need to play with or invest into better understanding atmospheric rivers, trying to sort of bring back stability of hydrological cycling, and therefore greater cooling potential, greater adaptive potential, greater mitigation, dividends, et cetera, et cetera. These are some of the things that the EU in particular, if it has to sort of arbitrate in terms of budgetary decisions, especially as we are against the clock in terms of the multi-annual financial framework, which is coming up next year. How do we invest essentially into different types of modeling? What are the alternatives and how do we resource them so as to say to the other people, no, this vision that is being entertained in terms of post-planetary exits, transhumanism, this is not the majority project, and other polities will stick behind a different vision and will resource the investments in terms of modeling, in terms of experimentations, in terms of alliances, and in terms of new adaptive potential to go in a different direction.
That was a lot. Thank you very much indeed. I think, yeah, we peeled through a lot of layers here. It's going to be impossible to summarize, so I'm not going to attempt that, but I do want to give the opportunity for the room to engage with this conversation also. We are approaching time very quickly, so let's jump right into that and have perhaps, Julia, you can loop an answer into a response to a question from the floor, if that works. Do we have? I see one hand up front.
Well, thank you. A lot to think about with this transhumanism story. The way I look at this is that you are making this the SRM an integral part of the context, right? Of the SRM. But I would say, well,
Situated within their map. It's not the central argument. I situate it within their map, but I don't put SRM at the center of the project.
Oh, what is really a part of the project? That's what you say, right? And I would say, well, it will be the task of, let's say, us in the EU and elsewhere across the globe against the Silicon Valley boys, that we should change their context. Because SRM is really... Oh, that's better. Because, well, again then, on the one hand, I see the context of the technological, the power of the Silicon Valley boys, and I see SRM, which started as a climate intervention technique. And I think it should stay there. So it should remain a climate intervention technique, which means that we should have all the political power that we can mobilize for this to change this context from the Silicon Valley development over there. So remove the power of, if we can, from the Peter Thiels, the Elon Musks and all those guys. And I think this is starting now. So the realization that we are too dependent on them has started, and we try to get the power back again. So I'm not really sure how your vision for the next decades will hold, because we do already see a political movement that, well, we have to reduce their power and we have to put regulations in place to minimize it more. So, well, I'm not sure, this is not a question, it's more like a remark before we go for dinner.
So in other words, I think if there is a question, it's about the how to deal with the challenge that is being described in terms of power, questions of empowerment of legitimate actors at the same time, legitimate knowledge, if that's a concept. Perhaps we get a couple of questions and then have the panel respond as also the final set of statements. Thanks, go ahead.
Thank you. I want to sort of, in the discussions that I heard today, I also felt like when it comes to proposals of research governance, there's two kind of different accusations that are thrown at those that try to imagine a positive version of research governance. One of them is that you don't engage with realities of political power. And the other one is that sort of like, we're too naive, right? Like those are the two kinds of one. But based on what you two said, I would say that there is other ways in which that can be interpreted, where this kind of naivete, this kind of wish that actually positive research governance can do something good, can be part of your vision for the overall, right? So in this, I would like your comment about, again, is it possible, do you think that it is possible indeed to integrate this positive version and say, we want to be against those kind of, techno-fascism by being their watchdog through our research? So that's sort of my question or provocation, maybe.
Thanks. And perhaps one third question. I saw David near the speaker on the right. Yes.
Thank you. Yes, David Santillo from Greenpeace. Oh, I'll probably get feedback from the speaker. It's just a simple question. Should we stop talking about building trust? And is there something instead that we should be doing? I'm not sure you can build trust, and if you try to build it, very often it backfires because people don't trust you. So is there something that should be done in order to earn that trust? And what are we earning trust in?
So if I'm to recap the three questions into almost a similar one, I think, first, given power differentials and challenges around power, how can, and I'm lumping Daniela's question into that, research governance be a tool for empowerment of legitimate actors? And the question on trust, I think, links to that, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of, well, knowledge is power, and therefore the way knowledge is produced is a tool of influence into this world, and this can be approached better or worse in different ways. So I'll leave that with the panelists and invite them to use that as their set of final remarks.
Okay, for me, to build trust is good to co-create, to design the research policy questions together. It won't serve any good when research has been done, completed, validated, published, and then we take a kind of summary or policy brief after the research, and we say, okay, now it is the turn of the policymakers. Now I want to go and engage them. So it will look as if the aspect of governance is an afterthought because the research had been done, completed. But in a situation where you have everyone, being brought on board together to design what do we really need? What are the policy questions or the decision questions that the scientists are supposed to respond to? And then we could create a kind of an agenda, research agenda together. And that is why issue of power and control that we mentioned also influences transparency. If those who have the technologies, those who have the capacity are transparent enough, or they're willing to be transparent enough, then capacity sharing that she mentioned comes into play. So no region wants to be seen as a kind of a recipient of technologies or innovations around climate interventions because it affects the economy, it affects the entire human system, and so they want to be a part of the design right from the beginning. So that would be my comment on that, that industrialized countries, developed countries who have the technology, because we really need the technology, we really need it, but you want others to trust you and then bring them on board right from the beginning. Issues that concerns data sharing, issues that concerns environmental impact assessment perhaps, and ESG safeguards are needed to be co-designed right from the beginning of the research, not at the end of the research. And then what should be communicated as well should be in language that could be understandable. And I will also emphasize my last word, we need locally led research, because research agenda could come from anywhere and fly into the region and are not context specific to the region's regional issues at hand. But can we have homegrown research where indigenous knowledge system comes to play, where marginalized societies, vulnerable communities are part of the design? So with that, I think once we have such kind of an agenda setting, trust can be built, transparency can be accepted, and we will be conducting research that is socially acceptable.
Thank you. I'm inviting any of the three remaining panelists also.
I only wanted to to say that what Olivia mentioned about, I think it's, this is a very interesting debate, very good. And it's difficult to put an end word on this to finish. But I don't really agree with this big picture that we have a new kind of humanity coming, the future of civilization, it's at stakes. It sounds, in some way, this project that you are describing sounds like very conspiratory. And I couldn't avoid to feel like a puppet in that description, no? Or we are like puppets in discussing small issues when the big issues are out there, arranged by a couple of people together in a room or online, let's say, whatever. But I don't have that impression, because what you are describing is a kind of as conspiracy theory without clear demonstration, without clear data. It makes sense in some way for you, but it doesn't make sense for me, because all conspiracy theories have elements of truth. And they are believed because they mix elements. But I agree more with the messy perspective of the world. I like that word for our world. It's messy, it's conflictive, but there is not some people might have a plan, a project, the project, but it's not, they are not the only ones that have a project, and they are not the only ones that have the power. There are other powers in conflict. So I think that the picture is very complex, much more complex than that. Maybe there are some actors that would like to manipulate the world, of course, always have been, but I think that this meta-narrative of history, where it is going, it sounds very much like the narratives of the 19th century. No? This perspective that the future, we don't know. The future is not determined, and nobody will determine it although they try. It's not possible, because there are many forces in conflict. So I use that time, my time, sorry, I'm not replying to all the questions, but I think that it's important to address this difference between a plan, between a messy world, no? Where plans can be planned, but not really implemented as people, these planners would like. Thank you.
Thank you.
You for the opportunity for the debate.
I'll reassure, just an anecdote. Most of the time when I go for drinks with my friends or my family and they ask me, what do you work on at the moment? And I talk about techno-fascism, techno-transcendence and things like this. They sort of sit there silently and they're like, has she gone completely cuckoo? So I empathize with your family. But you seem to empathize with my family. I empathize with your reaction. And maybe it helps also to sort of like situate my own professional bias. I'm a peace and security practitioner. I come from working in conflict zones at the beginning of my career, and then sort of focusing mostly on the fact that the energy transition and the digital transition have been understood as technical matters, when in fact they were the vessels for a power and geostrategic transition. And that we now find ourselves, and this is very apparent, in a moment of history, what I think indeed is a civilizational juncture, not just a historical juncture, but a civilizational one, where security dilemmas are essentially sort of, like manifesting over, fighting over the substrates of societies, energy, materials, ecological foundations. We tend to think that powers don't think about them, that the likes of Trump do not care about climate change or things like this, but when you hear them talking about climate change in terms of its impacts regarding Canada or Greenland, it doesn't quite fit the picture of a person who's a climate denier. And we're also fighting about the horizons of the technological transformations that are playing out in economic spheres, in cultural ones, partially related to conspiracy theory spreads, right? How to use information manipulation, information environment engineering to try and sort of create cleavages and disruptions within coherent polities, within democratic polities as well, right? And when I observe essentially, because I didn't come here to talk about the whole techno-fascist project, and obviously like your point is well taken that I didn't have the time for demonstration, but when you look essentially at some of the personalities and some of the actors, VC actors, positioning themselves on techno-military industrial complex transformation, acquisition of land, manipulation or sort of like designing of certain governance space related to climate action, including around CDR, acquisition of certain types of technologies and investment in technologies which have to do with agri-tech and biotech, with transhumanism, with longevity, with weather modification, with climate modification and other forms of planetary modification, you start wondering why we're looking at all of these ecosystems of investments and actors in silos, when in fact, when you look at them as a whole, there's a different picture that emerges. Now, you raise another point, which is absolutely fair. There is a difference between a plan and a plan that works and gets implemented. On this, what I will answer is, with people who have acquired political power, military power, technological power, financial power, however bonkers their own vision is, we can't afford not to look at them and not to take them seriously. Whether or not they will eventually manage, whether or not even the notion of techno-transcendence is feasible, is a different matter. And this is why I was insisting on the fact that there needs to be a different kind of organization of the actors that still want SRM to stay tethered to the climate space. Something which is essentially, which requires honest, authentic, triangulated, transparent, ethical, responsible research. Which is why the EU and other actors that do not subscribe to any type of vision like this need to demolish the space for commercial SRM. Demolish it by any means possible. And then the rest is essentially, and this is why we have a weird convergence at the moment, if we want this to happen, we also need to look at the role of DG Comp, for example. Not just DG Klima or DG Env or EAS, and I will finish on this.
But also, perhaps for the audience that's not familiar with EU institutions, the spelling out.
DG Competition. The directorate which is in charge essentially of competition matters. DG Comp has a role to play in looking now at SRM and saying, are we facing a risk regarding some kind of either actor or ecosystem monopolization, which creates economies of scale, which will mean that honest researchers who are coming to this topic with honest intentions will be paper tigers. This should not happen. This is something that we should avoid, and there's still time to make sure that this is avoided. And I'll end on this. Jeroen, I'm sure you'll have plenty to say.
Thank you very much. And I think one of those points resonates with what I heard from David as well, which I think I hope everyone in this room also agrees with, is that decisions on the issue in the end won't be in the academic space. And I think this is an assumption that has been clear for a long time. But at the same time, I think there are questions as to how the academic space is structured, given the backdrop that you're describing, which very much looks at power, which I agree is an important thing to do. I would perhaps not do it exclusively, but I see the urgency in that regard.
Just to be clear, again, the message is that's what I was trying to say. There's a difference between the technological threshold research with all of the stuff that comes with it and the technological hedging strategy. The technological threshold needs to be looked at, needs to be investigated. Personal disclaimer, I don't really fancy a future in which we deploy SRM, but that's coming from a place of non-scientific understanding, right? Or non-scientific research, just security research. What I do know is that the actors that are organizing on the other side are likely to crush the space in which honest researchers get organized. That needs to be avoided.
Thank you. That was actually very clear, indeed, a great summary. With that, Jeroen, last words.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to just take the questions from the front. After, I do want to stress, when I listen to both of us saying, I don't think either of us makes any claim about what will happen. Right? We're making a claim that specifically departs from that notion of messiness. I also deliberately, and I'm coming to your point, Herman, avoided to go specifically into the techno-fascist. And I'm just saying powers as they are structured today are historically contingent and they're being renegotiated. And yes, I think there's an enormous mobilization of power, money, all of the things that you mentioned on the tech fascist side. And I think that's probably the most important thing to keep in mind at this particular juncture in time. But I think the question, I guess, on all of our minds related to SRM is how do you tether this to the climate, right? That's what you said. How can we make sure that this maintains its status as a climate technology? Well, I think the very first thing that we need to recognize is that the climate as a concern is not a homogeneous concern either, right? It is potentially a very securitized concern, as we just heard in Olivia's, implicitly in Olivia's contribution. These climate deniers are simultaneously making bets on resource futures in the Arctic, in Greenland. They're not deniers. They are definitely thinking about something else as well. So you can have a climate policy, you could have an SRM tethered firmly to climate that simultaneously is deeply fascist. And I think one of my PhD students is researching circular economy, and she was reading this book called Empire of Rag and Bones, and it's about Nazi Germany. That is basically doing circular economics on all the same sort of premises of resource autonomy, resource circularity that we now preface in circular economics, but does it as a sort of integral part of war effort and genocide. So just tethering it to the climate is not enough. And so that, I think, is also the question that I wanted to answer to you, Daniela, is how can we, if we want to have a positive effect on this? I'm sure that every single person in this room believes in the power of doing positive work. Otherwise, I don't think I'd be here anymore. And I know that a lot of people who I agree with typically are also still here all the time. But it cannot be by simply accepting the status quo as it is and having this, yes, naive conversation without including power structures and how power structures remake not only what we can do, but also fundamentally what we consider to be normal, and what we consider to be desirable. And I think that conversation needs to somehow be internalized in research governance. And I don't know how to do it. I'll leave that to you.
Thank you, Jeroen. That sounds like homework to me. And that's a great note to end on, and also give a quick outlook to tomorrow. But before I do that, I do want to thank the panel very much for the very rich and very engaging conversation that definitely has peeled a lot of layers, and is definitely thought-provoking. I would try to anchor, perhaps attempt to anchor one concept that I'm hearing cutting across this, in this question of power, agency, and on the other side of that, resignation, which can also be a risk in this, where I think we do need to, no matter how we look towards the future, the way we imagine the future is a very powerful thing. That shapes, I think, our abilities to make a difference. And I do want to land on that. Also, that point, Jeroen, you just made, I think we all here are looking to make a difference and actually trying to grapple with complex questions, governance of research on this issue being one that we have chosen to focus on. And on that note, tomorrow we'll get a chance to do that a lot more, still with hopefully a lot more specificity even, focusing on the question of what needs different types of stakeholders have on that issue, those that are looking to make a good, positive impact, and then how can we, basically to make it really specific, how can this co-create project help answer some of those needs by providing structure and ideas in our work that might help take things a little bit forward to not remain stuck in this complex issue. And so on that note, if we could have the last slide to show, just for a bit of housekeeping, dinner is awaiting us at 7:15 at Bouillon, Bruxelles. You can see the address. You can also get the Google Maps directions by scanning the QR code. And I also want to say, encourage everyone to come back here tomorrow at, I think, 9. We will be starting 9:30 tomorrow, so be back at 9:15 if you want to grab a coffee and get ready for the, well, to work, essentially, to work out some of these questions in the co-creation labs. And with that, I don't want to hold us back further. You have two options. You can either go back to your hotel until such time as dinner is ready, or stick around, engage in continuing conversation, or answer some emails and then walk over, or maybe find a bar nearby is what Daniele, I think, is saying. So feel free, choose your own adventure. And again, thank you to our panelists. A big round of applause.